There's a rumor going around. If you like this video and subscribe, you unlock Dead Bone Pulse. Hi guys, this is the first part of What If Natsu Was the Son of Acnologia? I hope you enjoy. What are you talking about? He killed that damn demon. Urza moved as she yelled at the frog. While what you say is true, he also destroyed Oshibana Station and the meeting hall. Oshibana Station was destroyed by Eisenwald, Lucy objected. And control room as well. The doors along with controls are so damaged it all has to be replaced, Councilman questioned with a raised eyebrow. Lucy opened her mouth to reply, but the councilman continued, "No need to reply, I know the answer, we were all there." Wendy objected, "Shouldn't we also bear some consequences?" Natsu looked at his adopted sister, glad he stood by him as she always did. His eyes drifted at the councilman, a small pang of guilt rising in his heart before he squashed it mercilessly. He promised her they would find their parents one day, but how to tell her he already knew where Grandini was? It was forbidden. The violation of the rules brought by Dragon's Council was punished by death. The council sent me only to bring Natsu Souleater. I have no authority nor desire to arrest anyone else, the frog said. But Gray was stopped from saying anything else as Natsu raised his hand up, the back of his hand facing the ice mage in a sign to stay silent. "I'll leave with you," Natsu spoke as he looked at the frog man and the knights behind him, who all visibly relaxed. If he refused, there was really nothing they could do to make him go. "But brother," Wendy looked at him as her lips trembled for a second before she bites it until it turned white. "Wendy," Natsu said as he glanced at her, his voice unusually sharp, "don't cry." Wendy blinked at him, brushing the moisture from her eye that had yet to leave them. "I wasn't going to," she insisted. Natsu's lips twitched up again. "Of course," she smiled at him as he turned around and walked by Rune Knights and Frog Man, who quickly followed, the Rune Knights moving to tie his hands with magic concealing cuffs, only to stop as Natsu said, "Not even looking at them, don't even think about it." Rune Knights retreated their hands in a blink of an eye, of course, as Natsu disappeared from their view along with the councilman. Guild was left in silence, shocked at the sudden change in events. Mira looked around and sighed as her eyes turned back to the spot Natsu could last be seen further down the street. Just a few words with them, nothing else, she thought, with a small smirk forming on her lips as she slipped away from her guildmates, unnoticed. Natsu walked beside the Frog Man trough, the antique-styled hallway of Fiore's branch council building lined with columns. The silence between the two was something Natsu greeted with open arms, and the Frog Man beside him didn't seem to mind it either. With his eyes fixed in front of himself, Natsu immediately noticed the appearance of a new figure in the hallway, the figure leaning on the column. "Seagrain," Natsu said in a way of greeting as he passed the projection. The Frog Man's eyes widened as he dropped to the ground in a bow. "Is that all I will get from you, Soul Eater?" the blue-haired man asked with a grin as he inclined his head to the side. "It is more than you deserve," Natsu replied as he looked at him. "Ah, now that's rude," Seagrain said with small smile, obviously not offended but finding the whole situation amusing. "You are not even standing before me in person," Natsu pointed out. "Most people would be a lot more offended by thizzes." Seagrain smiled again as he waved his hand through the air dismissively. "Most people wouldn't speak to me in the way you speak. Is that supposed to be a warning? I am not going to show more respect to a man that doesn't deserve it, always with jokes." "I am not joking," Seagrain snorted, "of course." "Well, I'm off to the courtroom. You'll be there soon enough." As the thought projection disappeared, the Frog Man stared at Natsu. "You know someone that important?" Natsu looked at the man. "I know important people, but I would hardly sort him with them." "We will now start mage trial," called the Frog Man. "Defendant Natsu Souleater." Natsu looked at the people seated in the seats above him, watching him carefully. "Please take a witness stand." The councilman seated in the middle spoke in a gruff voice that matched his appearance. "Defendant Natsu Souleater. Concerning the terrorist incident at Eisenwald the other day, you are suspected of destroying part of Oshibana Station, Ryuzuka Canyon's railway bridge, and an entire mansion in Clover." Natsu's face didn't change as the councilman listed. According to witness testimony, the culprit is a man with pink hair. Natsu's eye twitched. "It's not pink," and the man got no further as the doors of the courtroom exploded open. "What in the world?" the councilman yelled in outrage as he rose to his full height, which was not a small amount, and slammed his fist on the table. Natsu's eye twitched again as an identical replica of himself stepped from the smoke risen by the explosion. "I am Natsu Souleater," the replica replied in unusually high voice for a male person. Noticing the slip, the replica cleared its throat, "Arrest me if you can." Now the voice matched Natsu's perfectly. Natsu resisted the strong urge to face palm and settled for the small parting of his jaw. "I'm gonna kill her. Tell me what I'm guilty of and make sure it's more important than the lives of the guild masters." The councilman in the middle seemed to share Natsu's ideas, but he simply replied, "Put them in jail." Natsu turned to look at him, but before he could say anything his replica yelled at the man, "Wait a minute. You can't put an innocent man in prison," she said, pointing at Natsu, who couldn't help it anymore as his hand slapped over his forehead, his head shaking in disbelief. "Could it be separate jail cells by any chance?" Natsu asked after a moment. His replica turning to stare at him, her voice again not his own, "What? Don't agree to this, Natsu, you're innocent." The replica stiffened as it spoke in his voice again, "I mean, I'm Natsu." Councilman ignored the replica completely as he looked at Natsu. "Granted." Mira glared at Natsu trough the bars of their separate cells. Natsu sat in the middle of his cell, his back turned to her as he stared at the moon from the window. "Won't you say something?" Mira huffed after few more minutes of silence. "I'm too shocked to say a word," Natsu replied as he looked at her over his shoulder. "It was just a formality." Mira blinked. "Formality?" Natsu sighed soundlessly again, his shoulders sagging slightly before he straightened his back again. "The arrest was just a facade. The council needed to display their authority so that they can keep us in check." "What do you mean?" She knew it full well. Natsu's eye twitched again as he looked back at the moon through the small barred window. "Meaning, I would be sentenced guilty, but I wouldn't receive any punishment. I would have already been home if you didn't go wild." Mira smiled uneasily. "I didn't think, indeed." "You didn't think at all?" Mira frowned as she huffed. "That's not what I was about to say, and what were you going to say?" Mira stubbornly stayed quiet, her face slowly reddening. "That's what I thought." They stayed in silence for a long moment. "I appreciate the gesture though." He didn't look back as he said it, so he didn't saw as Mira looked away, her face red. "It won't be long, Natsu," Seagrain said as he looked at the pink-head trough, the glass orb in his hands, the man staring at the moon that was invisible in the small orb. "It won't be long. It's been over a week since Natsu was arrested." The moment they entered the guild, Wendy was next to Natsu, asking him if it went well. The only answer she got was a relatively long look from Natsu. Wendy blushed at the stupid question. "Do you want to go out of the guild for a week or two?" Natsu asked after a moment. Wendy looked away for a second and Natsu knew the answer. The answer he didn't expect. "For a job, you know. We didn't go on one alone for more than a month." It didn't sound long, but for the two it was. It was rare if they had 2 weeks between the missions they took together. "What changed?" He looked at Wendy. Was it because of what was hidden behind the bandages on his left palm? Natsu involuntarily moved his left hand out of Wendy's line of sight. Wendy looked at the floor feeling guilty. But what could she do? She could barely look at her brother without crying. He was suffering and only she knew it. Only she knew it, and she couldn't do a damn thing. "I promised Urza I'll go with her and her team on a job." We're leaving today afternoon." "Urza has a team?" Natsu asked. That was new. Wendy nodded as she bit her lower lip. "Lucy, Gray and Urza, by the sounds of it you as well," Natsu concluded. "I guesses." Natsu nodded as he walked away. Wendy stayed quiet. The Dragon Slayer walked to the second floor where Laxus sat on the railings. The blonde didn't move as Natsu walked by to the mission board and after a moment torn off 2 S-class mission flyers. Without a word to anyone, Natsu departed by a hole that opened beneath the Dragon Slayer with the quiet incantation leaving his lips. Laxus snorted. "Show off." Down on the first floor, Wendy was looking at her full glass of orange juice. "Why the long face, Wendy?" Mira asked as she moved to the smaller girl. Wendy looked up at her. "I'm a jerk." Carla, who sat beside the girl, looked at her. "Happy speaking first, how come?" "Ouch. Why did you do that?" Happy glared at Carla, who sniffed. "That's no way to ask someone what's wrong." Mira looked from the cat's back at Wendy. "Natsu asked me to come with him on a job." Mira frowned, not seeing the problem. "Or Natsu for that matter. But I promised I would go with Urza and her team already. I don't really see how does that make you a jerk, Wendy," Mira commented. "If Natsu's angry, which I doubt, he has no right to be whatsoever." Wendy bit her lower lip. She couldn't tell Mira further reasons. Not without breaking her promise to Natsu. I know, but we are really spending too little time together recently. I mean, you know how he is. He might act like a loner, but he's not against the company. He simply can't talk with people like you and I can because he doesn't know how. Mira hummed in agreement. True, however, that doesn't mean that you have to spend your time with him all the time simply because he has no one else to be with, Wendy nodded. It's not that I don't want to spend time with him. I can't even look at him at the moment and it's not even his fault, but that's not something she could tell her, is it? You are right, she said instead, forcing a smile on her face. Mira smiled back as she turned around, responding to the calls of few members asking for more beer. Wendy sighed as she stood up. Where are you going? Carla asked as Wendy turned towards the doors. Wendy stopped. Where was she going? To pack. Carla frowned. You don't know. To pack? The white cat smiled as she stood up as well and flown to her, Wendy taking her in her arms. I'll go with you then, Carla said. Happy looked at them with frown. Hey, what about me? Wendy smiled. You can come with us if you want. Happy grinned as he spread his wings. Aye, sir. The recently named Team Urza walked through the streets of Magnolia towards Guild after the successfully completed mission. Urza looked around. Something was weird. But what? The city was as busy as always at this time of day, but it was only quiet. Urza's eyes locked with the eyes of a nearby citizen and she realized something quite unsettling. Why are they looking at us like that? The redhead mused. Wendy shuddered. I don't like fizzes. Something's not right. Gray, who didn't want any more attention, muttered quietly. Let's get to the guild, Urza said. They will know what's going on. Titania's pace increased, but others didn't complain, following the redhead without a word. They walked the rest of the way in silence, strange looks still following them, and with each step Urza's stomach contracted into a tighter ball. When they saw the outline of the guild in the distance they broke into a run, and when they reached it they were left in horror-induced silence. From the tall building that was Fairy Tale's Guild Hall were protruding large iron pools, destroying the beautiful structure that was Guild's pride and joy. Destroying their home. Gray glanced at Urza, who looked at the stone floor, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles turned white. They moved inside. Lucy's fingers sneaked around her keys as she looked at the horror that surrounded them. A sword flashed in Urza's hand before she forced it to disappear. Temperature around Gray dropped and Wendy gripped Carla tighter, her hair moving through the air as if the light wind was blowing in deadly silent hall, while Happy landed next to Wendy, looking around the guild with wide eyes. The trap doors that lead to the basement opened with a creak, attracting their attention. I thought I heard someone. Mira looked at them, her eyes puffy but a smile clasped on her face. The smile that was on her face far from her eyes. What happened here? Urza cried in outrage, finally finding her voice. Come to the basement. We have set a temporary hall there, Mira said, gesturing towards the trap door that led into the basement behind the bar, or rather what was left of it, because one of the iron pillars passed straight through it. Who would do something like this? Wendy asked, as her eyes watered, tears streaming down her face. This was her home. This was her only home since Grandini left her. Master will explain everything, Mira said as she walked down the stairs. The basement, formerly used to store barrels, was filled with guild members sitting around a few tables that were in decent enough shape to be carried down from the upper floor. Urza looked around, finding the master in a second, but not in the shape she hoped. With the mug in his hand, Makarov looked as though he had been drinking for hours, which was probably the case. Even though he had a stupidly big smile on his face, he radiated gloomy energy just as every other member inside the basement. When Makarov noticed them walking toward him, his smile became painfully more strained on his old face. You're back, he observed. You must be wondering what happened. Urza nodded, the muscles in her jaw tightening as she hissed out. Yeses. Her fist shook with barely contained anger. You know that Fairy Tale has rivals. Master was never able to finish as Macau yelled. You call this rivalry? Phantom Lord should pay for what they've done. Macau yelled. Phantom Lord did this. Gray yelled angrily as he slammed his fist into the nearby barrel, breaking the top wooden lid. Wendy could feel her magic rising in anger, something she rarely if ever experienced. How could they do this? We should make them pay, Urza yelled, and other members cheered for her. Yeah, why are we still sitting here? Gray yelled. They want war. They'll get it, Elfman cried and bumped his fist in the air. Silence. Makarov's voice boomed in the basement. Everybody went silent in a second. We are not going to attack Phantom Lord. Makarov's voice boomed once again. But Master. Gray started but didn't get far. No buts. We can easily fix Guild Hall, but if we attack Phantom Lord, the council will again have us on their hit list. Makarov yelled before he looked away, sitting down on the barrel again with a sigh, muttering the last part, like we already don't have enough problems with them. No one else dared to speak out. The sky was colored orange as the sun began to set, the streets of Magnolia already losing its shape in the long shadows. Guys, you don't have to walk me all the way home. I'll be fine, Levy said to Droy and Jet, but the two only grinned in return. Master said that we should go in groups because there might still be some members of Phantom Lord lingering around, Jet said. And we don't want you to get hurt, Droy explained with a grin. Ah, you're so sweet, Levy said with a warm smile gracing her lips as she turned to look at the road in front of herself. Jet and Droy looked at her as if on Heaven 9 before looking at each other simultaneously, glaring daggers at the other boy. She said that to me, Jet exclaimed first as he crossed his arms over his chest with a huff. That's not what I heard. She was obviously talking to me. Droy objected. Jet looked at him, scandalized. No, she wasn't. Levy giggled as she looked at the setting sun, her smile turning forced for a moment. What will happen now? Will Phantom Lord continue with whatever they are trying to do? The three wizards stayed oblivious to the red eyes following them from the alley, but the deep-throated chuckle couldn't be missed. Who's there? Droy yelled and stood in front of Levy while the three turned to look behind only to see nothing. Show yourself, Jet yelled and stood on the other side. They never heard an answer as darkness overtook their vision. Trough empty streets of Magnolia, a sound of an iron dragged across the stone streets echoed. The sun has set a few hours ago, but the Magnolia Park was unusually full of people. Every last one of them horrified beyond belief at the sight of three mages nailed to the giant oak tree in the center of the park. Coming through, Urza said as she pushed away some of the bystanders trying to get a clear look at what was raising the commotion. We're from the guild, Grace said, moving behind Urza just as quickly as she was. It didn't take long for them to see it. It was despicable. Levy, Lucy cried in shock as she almost dropped to her knees, horrified by the sight in front of her. Urza clenched her hands at her side, unable to move her eyes away from the horrible picture. Jet, Droy, Gray stared at them with his mouth hanging open in shock and terror that crept in his bones. Wendy stood beside them, tears once again flowing down her cheeks for the second time in one day. In front of them, nailed to the oak tree, hung Levy, Jet, and Droy crucified and beaten. Blood slowly dripped from Levy's parted lips, her eyes closed. Drip, drop. Wendy's stomach turned at the sound and smell. Drip, drop. On Levy's exposed stomach, symbol of Phantom Lord was cut into her skin, blood flowing from the wound that will probably leave a scar in the horrible shape. Another tear rolled down Wendy's cheek. How could they do this? She asked no one in particular, but she didn't expect the answer. Mira came to them and knelt beside Wendy. She hugged her strongly and whispered, "Don't cry, Wendy. They will pay." "That is correct," Makarov spoke as he walked to them. "They will pay." Makarov's face was gravely serious, fists clenched to the point where his nails dug into his palms, drawing blood. White-hot fury boiled through his veins as he looked at the terrible sight in front of himself. Because they dared to hurt his children, they will pay. A certain sentence he heard their resident dragon slayer say few times coming to his mind. They will suffer. As Makarov walked closer, everyone moved out of the way. Even without using his Titan magic, the master seemed huge, but it was his massive aura rather than actual size responsible. As Makarov moved closer, several members started taking down Levy and her two friends from the tree, carefully so not to aggravate the injuries. When Levy touched the ground, Wendy was already above her, her hands glowing in the soft golden light as the engraved symbol on her stomach started disappearing. The scar that would surely stay there any other way disappeared before even forming. "I do not care if someone laughs at me," Makarov said in low voice. "I will not hit back if someone destroys my home," he said little louder. "But there's one thing that I will not tolerate." He started growing into his Titan form. "I cannot and I will not tolerate my children getting hurt." He was now towering above the tree. "Phantom Lord brought our fury on themselves. They wanted war. They will get it. They made a mistake they will regret." His voice roared through the city. "Fairy tale. Prepare yourself. Phantom Lord started this war. We will finish it." Master yelled and pumped his fist in the air. Everyone else followed his example and raised their hands. "Yeah." Laughter and clinking of glasses echoed through dark, large hall of the Phantom Lord. "Ha ha ha, you should have seen their faces when Gajil hit them. said one member. They didn't know what hit them. It's not fair, you know. Why Gajil always gets the jobs with most fun? I want to pluck the wings of some fairy. I want to make the crash to the earth. Well, they were stupid enough to declare war on us, so we will all get out fair numbers of fairies to torture. The hall erupted in laughter. The laughter came to an abrupt stop when the doors of the guild exploded open, kicking up the dust. Knock, knock, Phantom Lord. Fairy Tail is here to kick your sorry asses. Gray yelled as he stood next to Urza, cold Excalibur resting on his shoulder. Behind the two stood every Fairy Tail mage that was the day before in the guild. Makarov stood few steps in front of them, slowly growing into his Titan form. The members of Phantom Lord stayed silent for a long moment, completely shocked at the sudden arrival of their enemies. The shock didn't last long as Phantom Lord screeched in anger before the members cried out, the battle cry leaving their lips as they charged forward. The weapons appearing in their hands, magic circles shining beneath them. Fairy Tail didn't wait even for a second as they joined the crash. Urza was the first to reach her enemy as the sword of her black wing armor cut through the steel of her opponents like a hot knife through butter, slashing the member in a second, the blood spraying the floor, but the cut never deep enough to kill him. I will make you pay for what you did, Urza screamed as she charged forward once again. Urza, Makarov called as he moved next to her, his fist growing in size as he pushed another member in the ground, the stone cracking beneath the pressure. I have few words for Jose. You are in charge. Urza whipped around with her blade as she rose in the air to avoid the slash aimed at her back. Understood. Makarov nodded as he made his way through the battle toward the stairs. He will end this lunacy now. Urza looked around as the sword in her hands disappeared and replaced itself with long katana, her armor following as bandages warped around her chest and red pants around her legs. Her bare feet met the head of nearby member before she landed in a crunch, the katana piercing the flesh of one girl's thigh. A giant of a man moved towards her, but before she could turn around, giant ice hammer smashed in the side of his face, sending him flying in the wall. The battle raged as more blood stained the floors. Gray spun around, ice spikes glued to his elbows as he slashed the bare torso of a member with already blood-soaked ice blades. The smell of blood made the teenager scrunch his nose in disgust, but he pressed forward, ice cannon already in his hands, clearing his path through the guild. The ceiling caved in suddenly and all eyes turned towards it. His heart squeezed painfully when he saw a small figure all too familiar falling through the hole. Urza screamed as she moved forward, running before her brain even fully registered what her eyes were seeing. Her body warping in black wing armor once again as she pushed herself from the ground. Master! Gray yelled in horror as Urza caught him. Retreat! Urza yelled at her guildmates. The anguish in her voice made any idea of opposition to the idea disappear as Fairy Tail moved out of Phantom Lord Guild Hall in hurried silence, pushing their way towards the doors. Meanwhile in Magnolia *, Lucy walked through the empty streets of Magnolia, not sure what to think of the situation. In the last few days, the streets that became familiar seemed suddenly distant, either unusually full or empty. Quiet. The town was quiet. I hope everything is all right, Lucy thought. I shouldn't worry about them so much, right? Plu looked at her as the small celestial spirit shook. Fuu Puan, Lucy smiled slightly at her spirit. You always know what to say, Plu. Plu seemed happy with it as the smile stretched its lips while he turned his head to look at Lucy. A drop of water hit him in the forehead and the small spirit jerked in surprise as it looked at the sky, Lucy's eyes following to it as well. The dark clouds covered the sun as the town warped itself in shadows. Rain, Lucy thought as the rain started pouring from the sky like a water from a bucket. Plu shook again, this time in fright as the small creature looked at its key's owner. Lucy looked at her spirit with reassuring smile. Don't worry. It's just rain. I'm sure it will pass soon. Drip, drip, drop. The voice was faint, barely hearable from the rain that was falling. Is anyone there? Lucy called out. The woman appeared before her, or rather came close enough so that she would actually see her. Drip, drip, drop, the woman in blue coat said as she lifted her pink umbrella slightly, letting Lucy see her face. Huh? Blonde asked, confused. Lovely sound, isn't it? The woman said in a monotone. Are you lost? Lucy questioned as she picked Plu up in her arms, not taking her eyes off of the mysterious woman. The woman looked with her blank eyes, looked at the creature in Lucy's hands but didn't say anything. Hello, I'm Lucy, Lucy introduced herself. Lucy laughed nervously when the woman didn't answer. Talk about the sudden change in weather, huh? The rain's really getting on my nerves. Woman twitched back like someone hit her. You are all the same, she whispered. Excuse me, Lucy asked when she saw the woman say something, but from the rain still loudly falling around them, she didn't hear her. The woman looked at her with narrowed eyes as she moved towards her. Juvia's rain is not annoying. Lucy took a step back in surprise. Juvia growled as she moved her hands in a circular motion before thrusting her hands forward. Water slicer. The blue magic circle appeared in front of her and the water exploded from it in a shape of a crescent. Lucy's eyes widened in shock as she threw herself on the ground, rolling out of the way as the attack passed above her, cutting the few strands of hair that were still in the air and cutting through the stone floor as it traveled in the distance, disappearing in one of Magnolia's many water channels, the moody water of the channel exploding in a geyser that raised in the air, unseen by the heavy rain. My. Juvia, calm down. We are not allowed to kill her. A new voice sounded before the man raised from the bare ground next to Juvia. Lucy tensed as she looked at the man that seemed to be missing quite a few essential bones in his body. Great, now there's two of them. The celestial mage slowly reached for her key pouch as the clue disappeared. The man turned to Lucy after a second. Mademoiselle, if you would be so kind and come with us peacefully. We take pride in ourselves that the clients of the Phantom Lord are always content with our job finished. That being said, our client would not be happy to see your pretty face hurt. Phantom Lord, you guys are from Phantom Lord? Lucy shrieked. My. Indeed, we are members of the Elemental Four. The name of my humble self is Saul, mademoiselle. A man named Saul said. Now, how will we do this, my belle mademoiselle? Will you come peacefully? You will. Gate of Giant Crab, I open thee, Cancer. Lucy cried, holding her key in front of her. What can I do for you, Ebby? Asked Celestial Spirit who just appeared. Attack, everything for you, Miss Lucy. Ebby, Cancer said, and then run towards Saul and Juvia. My. Saul continued with a sigh, I'll take that as a non. Your haircut is a horror. Ebby, Cancer commented as he moved towards Saul, who frowned. Why the insult? I didn't insult you, Monsieur Shrimp. I am not a shrimp, Ebby. Lucy's sweat dropped at the sentence. Really? Didn't she have any spirit, completely sane or normal? Saul chuckled. Of course, you're not, Monsieur Shrimp. You are really starting to annoy me, Ebby. Cancer said as he rushed at the man once again, but just as he came in front of him, the man sunk into the ground only to emerge behind. Lucy, seeing this, rushed forward, the warning never leaving her lips as Cancer turned around just as Saul cast the spell. The magic circle already formed beneath him. Roche Concerto. From brown magic circle flew barrage of massive rocks at Cancer at point-blank range. The spirit flew back with a cry of pain as the sharp missile pierced the skin. Cancer, Lucy cried as the spirit hit the ground, unable to raise. I have failed you, Miss Lucy. Ebby, Cancer muttered as he started to fade back to the world of celestial spirits where he would recover. I am sorry. Ebby, Lucy turned on her heel to glare at the man who was chuckling. My. What lovely fellow. With a growl, Lucy ripped the whip she carried from her belt and smashed it into the rock that cracked under pressure. Oh my, Saul said with another giggle. Seems we got someone angry, Juvia. Juvia looked at the man with a blank face but didn't reply. Saul sighed. You will pay for that, Lucy yelled as she charged at the man, one hand moving downwards in a slash with the whip in her head while the other fished another golden key. Gate of the Golden Bull, I open thee, Taurus. Lucy cried as she moved around Saul, standing between him and Juvia, who still didn't lower her umbrella but visibly tensed up. Lucy smirked. The girl might play emotionless, but after meeting Natsu, Lucy could conclude Juvia didn't even reach his knees. The bull man appeared in front of Saul while Lucy faced Juvia. Miss Lucy, I see you've been having some trouble with this Morans. Taurus yelled with a grin as he flexed his oversized axe in hands. Juvia lowered her umbrella as she took slightly guarded stance. Taurus charged at laughing Saul while Lucy moved at Juvia, but the moment her whip passed through the girl's body she knew she was in trouble. What the? Lucy voiced her confusion as she swung the whip at the girl again, the whip passing through the body of the girl, and as it exited on the other side Juvia caught the offending object. That is highly annoying. Juvia must put stop to it, the girl informed the blonde. Lucy looked at the hand that held her whip and tugged it, but this time it didn't budge from the grip of a surprisingly strong blue-haired woman in front of her. The Phantom Lord woman raised her free hand. Water lock. Crap, the next thing Lucy knew, she was in a water balloon, and more importantly, she could not breathe. The bubbles of precious air escaped from her mouth that opened in surprise, and Lucy watched helplessly at the bubbles exiting from the surface. Lucy looked around to look for Taurus, only to see her spirit disappear in similar golden light. Cancer disappeared moments ago, the spirit confused just as she was. Juvia's water lock severed your connection with that spirit temporarily, Juvia explained. Lucy cursed again, not wanting to waste the little time she had before the lack of air rendered her unconscious. Lucy reached for her keys. Surely she would be able to summon Aquarius. Her fingers brushed over the place where her keys should have been, only to realize they were not there. The muffled sound of the keys dangling caught her attention as Lucy's eyes darted toward Juvia, who was holding her keys. How did she? Juvia is water and water is Juvia, Juvia explained. You cannot hide your keys from Juvia when you are in water, Juvia created. Lucy blinked black dots out of her vision. Her consciousness was starting to slip sooner than she anticipated. She was almost sure she was imagining the blue dot fling at them with White Cat carrying the small blue head, but the result as the girl landed was undeniably real. Sky Dragon's roar. Juvia turned in surprise as Wendy landed in a crunch next to them, but had no way of avoiding as a tornado of wind erupted from girl's mouth, literally blowing her to pieces as her water-made body scattered. Saul looked at the puddle that used to be Juvia while the water mage slowly started reforming. Lucy, are you okay? Yelled Wendy. The water prison around Lucy exploded as she fell to the ground, gasping for air, the heavy rain pounding in her ears louder than Wendy's question. Thanks to you. Yay, Lucy answered. Lucy looked up as Happy landed next to her and helped her sit up. We came here as fast as we could. We sensed your magic rising only a minute ago. Lucy smiled at the small cat, who grinned back. Happy, take her to safety. Wendy and I'll take care of these two. Carla yelled as she kept her wings spread, flying above Wendy, who stood in front of Lucy in a low crunch. Aye, sir. Happy saluted before he spread his wings again, warping his tail around Lucy. Wait, Lucy struggled as Happy lifted her off the ground. We can't just leave them. They'll get hurt. Happy looked at her as if she was crazy. They won't get hurt. They are not weak, you weirdo. Lucy scowled at the insult as Happy grinned. They'll just buy us some time before coming after yous. The blonde looked back at Wendy, who was in the middle of avoiding a flying stone sent her way by Saul, who looked increasingly frustrated. You are a lot agiler than your friend, jeune mademoiselle. Saul noted. Wendy frowned for a second, not sure if she should answer, but after a moment she smirked. It's a must when you are a dragon slayer. Juvia's eyes widened in surprise as she looked at Saul. Juvia must not have heard her correctly, because Juvia heard she said she's a dragon slayer. The woman spoke as she looked at the young girl in front of herself. I'm afraid you heard her correctly, my dear femme de plus, Saul said with sigh, but she is not nearly as strong as Monsieur Gagil. Juvia nodded. Juvia agrees, but Iron Dragon is in a league of his own. The girl is strong but not strong as he is. Wendy's eyes widened as she looked at Carla, who shared her surprise. Did you just say? Iron Dragon. They must have been talking about Iron Dragon Slayer. Carla mused, but I thought those were just rumors. Saul laughed. Rumors, you say? Ah, no, not rumors. The truth, my dear Mademoiselle Minou. That being said, Saul looked towards the direction of the guild, the great hall not visible because of the rain. I believe we should take out leave. Our target escaped after all. He looked at Juvia, who nodded. Juvia agrees, but Juvia believes Master will not be happy, Juvia said softly. Wendy's eyes widened when the two turned their back to her. Stop. You won't escape. Saul looked over his shoulder at the girl and smiled. Oh, but we already have. Wendy's eyebrows scrunched in confusion before they widened again when Saul disappeared in the ground and Juvia in the rain, seemingly turning into it before Wendy's eyes. The Dragon Slayer launched herself at Juvia a second too late, and her wind-coated fingers sliced the only through the rain that stopped not even a moment later. They are gone, Wendy whispered before sighing in frustration. It's all right, Wendy, Carla assured her. We chased them away, and that's good as well. Wendy sniffed the air in hopes to find her missing foes, but only the thing her sensitive nose smelled was a lingering scent of rain. The young Dragon Slayer nodded after a moment. Let's go and see how Lucy's doing. She probably made to the guild by now. The two disappeared, this time walking rather than flying, leaving the street empty. The only sign of the fight that took place on it the long gash in the stone. Urza sighed as she looked around the basement of the guild as she entered it. Obviously, the news of what happened to Master reached the few that stayed behind while she and Mikao took him to Perliuzica. If it was even possible, the mood was worse than before they went to attack Phantom Lord. The redhead moved toward the table where her team sat, and by coming closer she realized something else happened while they were gone. They said that Target escaped. Wendy explained, already at the end of the story, I didn't realize what they were talking about at first, not until we came to the guild and I started telling Mira what happened. Urza frowned. What are you talking about? Gray sighed as he looked at the redhead. While we were out of Magnolia, 2 Phantom Lord wizards attacked Lucy and Wendy. Urza's eyes widened as she turned to look at Wendy and Lucy, who immediately spoke up, we're all right. And it is more accurate to say 2 Phantom Lord mages attacked me and then Wendy came to save me. Wendy's lips stretched into a thin line as she looked away. They were really strong, but they seemed reluctant to attack me when I said I was a dragon slayer. That must be because of their experience with them, Urza concluded as she tried to grasp the story. Experience with Dragon Slayer? What are you talking about? Lucy asked as she looked at Urza. Phantom Lord has their own Dragon Slayer, Iron Dragon Slayer to be exact. Lucy looked at Urza wide-eyed. What? I thought Wendy and Natsu were the only ones. Happy looked at her, giving her the same look he did earlier that day right before he insulted her. Don't even try, Lucy hissed at him. Happy chuckled. Weirdo. Wendy giggled despite the gloomy atmosphere. We are not the only one, Lucy. I'm not really sure how much of us there are currently, but Dragon Slayers used to be quite common back in the days we were at war with dragons. Natsu would be able to give you more detailed explanation. Lucy nodded while Urza turned towards Wendy, returning to the more pressing matters. What do you mean by target? That's what they said, Wendy explained, but by the looks of it they were talking about Lucy, I think. I know what they meant, Lucy said, her eyes traveling to the floor. What? Gray asked as all eyes turned on the blonde. My full name is Lucy Hartfilia. I am the daughter of a rich businessman, Jude Hartfilia. I think he sent those men to bring me back, but to be honest, I'm surprised he even noticed I was gone. I mean, why search now if not for 3 years? Tears started running down her cheeks as she looked up with tear-filled eyes at her team. I don't want to go back there. Never again. After my mom died. That wasn't home anymore. That was a prison. She looked away again, hiding the tear-streaked cheeks in shame. I want to stay in Fairy Tale. My family is here. My home is here. But I don't want anyone else getting hurt. I don't want anyone else to end up like Levi, I guess. Lucy said as a sob escaped her. She clenched her fist, still not looking up. She had to say it. I guess I should just go back there. It would be for the slap. Everyone looked in shock at Lucy, who held her cheek, small red print of a hand on it. Lucy, shocked out of her tears, stared at Wendy, who was standing in front of her. Wendy just slapped her. Wendy, don't even think about finishing that sentence, Wendy hissed. How can you even say that? You never ever have to go back there. She sounded pissed. But I don't, Lucy started again. We are family and we stick together. They were shocked beyond belief. They never heard Wendy sound so. She sounded really furious. The blue-haired girl sighed after a second as her eyes traveled to the ground before she looked back up. We are family here, Lucy. Don't think that we will just turn our back on you because it's easy. You could have realized by now that Fairy Tale doesn't want to do anything the easy way. Lucy stayed silent as the smaller girl hugged her. Myra's growl attracted the attention of Team Urza, who sat nearest to the white-haired beauty. You idiot, Mira yelled at the blonde-haired mage who was laughing on the other side of communication. Lacrima. How can you laugh at this? Master is down. Your guild needs you. Laxus smirked. You need me. Now that's new. Mira growled again. We don't have time for thizzes. I don't see Souleater anywhere around here, Laxus noted with a smirk. What? He's too good to come to the guild when you need someone, he mocked, imitating Myra's tone. Drop dead, will ya? Mira growled as she took the lacrima and crashed it into the wall. Laxus' laughter carried all the way to the wall before the lacrima exploded in pile of glass. The nerve of that man. Mira growled as she turned toward Kana, who was throwing playing cards at a map of fury. Any luck finding Natsu or Guildarts? Mira asked as she rubbed her temples, already feeling the headache coming. Kana sighed as a small magic circle appeared in front of her and she threw the card again, but the card simply circled around and returned to her hands. No. Kana turned to look at the oldest Strauss sibling. I don't get it. They are either not in fury or cowered by some strong cloaking spell. Mira sighed as she walked to the map. Where the heck are you guys? Their conversation was interrupted by small earthquakes that became louder and stronger with each passing moment. What now? Gray cried out as he rushed out, closely followed by Urza and then the rest of them. This doesn't sound good. Gray, being the first to reach the doors, threw them open and stopped dead in his tracks, Urza almost running into him because of the sudden stop. Why did you stop? Urza quieted down as her eyes traveled to the point where Gray was staring, her jaw falling slightly open. Towards them on four metal, spider-like legs moved Phantom Lord Guild Hall through the sea that stretched far behind Fairy Tales Guild Hall. The silence warped around the members who slowly moved out to stare at the unusual and quite frightening sight. The moving castle stopped almost 50 meters away from the shore as the voice of Phantom Lord's master rang through the silence. Give us Lucy Heartfilia and we'll forget this ever happened, a male, despicable voice of Master Jose roared through Magnolia. And you think we'll forget it? Urza screamed outraged. I swear to whatever god is above I will turn your thin neck and gouge your eyes out, you horrible hick. Following her example, the fairy tale mages yelled and shouted. Never. She's one of us. Jose laughed before he said, how pathetic. But since I'm in good mood today I'll count to 10 and then boom. I'll blow up your itsy bitsy, tiny, puny little guild hall with Jupiter cannon here. As he said that the front of the castle opened, the huge cannon coming into view. 10, 9, the front of the cannon started glowing. Over our dead bodies, Urza yelled, the rest of her guildmates yelling in agreement. Jose just laughed again. 8, 7, damn it, Gray cursed. It won't destroy just the guild hall. It'll kill us all. Are they mad? They won't do any of that. Urza exclaimed as she moved in front of the cannon, standing between the cannon and her guildmates. Urza, what are you doing? Asked Wendy in a shaky voice. Requip, adamantine armor, Urza cried as golden light warped around her, her armor changing into one where instead of swords a two-piece shield appeared in both hands. Have you lost your mind? Elfman asked incredulously. There's no way you can stop a freaking Jupiter cannon. Gray added as he eyed the cannon carefully. I have to at least try, Urza said as she dropped to one knee, bringing her hands together to form one shield. 1. The cannon fired and everyone closed their eyes as the pure beam of energy because they could not watch. Urza kept her eyes on the back of her armor, waiting for the beam of energy which never came. Her eyes caught the shadow as it jumped over her and the all too familiar voice shouted, Chaos Dragon's roar. All eyes shoot open focusing on the pinkhead who had his back turned to them, his roar fighting the Jupiter cannon and quickly overpowering it, the black and blue light moving toward the Phantom Lord Guild Hall with the speed greater than the cannon fired the beam that was now nowhere in sight. The roar soon collided with the cannon as the explosion rocked the place, raising the dust in the air. As the dust cleared it revealed a large hole in the front of the castle, the Jupiter cannon completely obliterated. What the, was all Jose was able to say. He was speechless just like everyone else. The silence was broken by Wendy who upon seeing Natsu ran toward him with a grin splitting her face. Natsu. She warped her hands around his waist, hugging him. Natsu stared at her for a second, feeling above awkward at the sudden contact before patting her head awkwardly, obviously not used to it, his back staying tensed and relaxing only when Wendy pulled back. How did you know we were in trouble? The girl asked. He looked up from Wendy, his eyes immediately falling on Kana as he glared at her. I felt the drunkard here trying to pinpoint my location even though I told her to not do that. Kana gulped as she pursed her lips, looking away. I wouldn't think much of it but since no one really ever searched for me, rather tried to get rid of me, I knew something was wrong. A small smirk stretched his lips as the sinister aura spiked behind him. Wait a minute, Gray started looking at Natsu, you came here because you were worried about us. At that everybody looked at Natsu in disbelief. No, don't be ridiculous. I came here because I was sure you won't be able to protect Wendy and Mira. He deadpanned. Others sweet-dropped. Of course, why do I even ask? Gray said. Their conversation was interrupted when Jose spoke again through the speakers. While it was an interesting display of your power I would advise you to pray to whatever god you believe in. There is no power on earth that can stop this. He sounded angry but then again who wouldn't? That cannon must have cost a fortune. There was a loud screech as one of the towers shifted followed by the rest of the castle. What the? Urza questioned in shock as she watched the once castle turning into a giant robot that towered over them. With another screech that made Wendy's and Natsu's teeth chatter the robot raised its hand, the tip of its metallic fingers lighting up in golden magic as it started drawing the circle on thin air. Wendy looked at her brother, whose eyes widened for a fraction that was nonetheless noticed by others, no matter how small it was. "Is there something wrong?" Gray asked before shaking his head, realizing the question was stupid. "No, scratch that. What's wrong? You know what spell is that?" Natsu clenched his hands into tight balls as he glared at the robot. "Are they insane?" Wendy's eyes widened in shock, mirrored by the rest of the guild members that surrounded them. Natsu rarely shouted outside of a combat. His magic sparked as those closest to him took a step back, the shock of the sudden spike in pressure around them making them sweat. "Brother?" Wendy asked worriedly, her quiet voice heard by Dragon Prince without any difficulty because of his sensitive hearing. Natsu bit the inside of his cheek before he spoke. "If that spell fires, it won't just destroy Magnolia. It will demolish her. We have to stop them," Urza yelled. "Sniff. This is all my fault." The sentence was spoken barely above a whisper, but in the panicked silence that had stretched over the small space, it was easily heard. Lucy sobbed, pressing the back of her hand against her eyes, trying to stop the flood of tears. "Sob. I'm so weak. I just bring trouble. You would be better off without me. ... Sniff." Urza bit her lower lip, saddened and quite a bit angry at Jose for upsetting her guild member to this extent. Lucy was not weak. She was about to walk to her, but a strong arm gripped her shoulder, the coldness of the arm strangely seeping through her armor, almost sending a chill down her spine. She glanced at the owner of the hand, gasping silently when black obsidian eyes looked her way before Natsu continued walking towards Lucy. She could clearly see his face, years of watching it allowing her to see the trickle of emotion showing on it. To anyone who saw the pink-haired dragon slayer, he looked barely annoyed, but Urza knew better. Annoyed Natsu didn't have a facial expression for an emotion as simple as an annoyance. No, this was fury. The blood-freezing fury that usually ended in a bloodbath. Titania knew quite well who the fury was directed at, but that did little to calm her. She never really talked much to the dragon slayer before her, but she talked to Mira, and she saw him around the guild in those rare times he was actually there. Mira had told her on numerous occasions of the bloodbaths that occurred on the missions they took together, and that was when he wasn't angry. The closest thing she could compare this type of fury was all those years ago when Lizana died, though this didn't get quite to that level, yet. Lucy was by now crying so hard that she didn't even notice that Natsu was approaching her. She certainly noticed when a finger tapped her shoulder, and due to her sleeveless shirt, she felt the freezing coldness of the owner rather easily, twitching slightly from it. She looked up, expecting to see Gray, since he was more or less the only logical person in her mind that could be this cold, but when she saw Natsu, her breath caught in her throat. He looked her straight into the eyes and Lucy froze. Black eyes, for the first time, didn't seem as empty as she remembered them. Barely visible and masterfully hidden emotions were clear to her for the first time, and she knew quite well it was because the pinkhead wanted it to be so. Lonely and compassionate eyes stared at her for a brief second before Natsu blinked, and like magic, the emotions disappeared. She was a little shocked when she saw the loneliness and compassion, as if he knew what it was like when those closest to you don't notice and neglect you. However, when she took into consideration who raised him, she felt even slightly guilty, because it must have been a lot worse. You have your family here and you don't have, you won't leave. Your father is rather an idiotic man if he thinks he can take fairy tale member against their will and get away with it, he whispered quietly to her through others heard him due to the silence his actions brought. Thank you, she said. For the rest of her life, she would swear that at the moment she saw a truly shocked expression cross his face, but it lasted for less than a second and his face fell to the same disturbingly emotionless and distant expression as it was most of the time. Don't thank me, thank them, he said, pointing at the other members. All that I do for this guild is for Mira and Wendy. I have no particular attachments to anyone else who's here at the moment. The vague implication he considered someone else worth his attention confused Lucy for a moment before she noticed the slight twitch of his lips. Black eyes looked around and the dragon slayer quickly grabbed Redus's forearm, making the large man yelp in shock, and before he could truly question dragon slayer's actions, Natsu spoke. Keep an eye on her, will ya? Redus also noticed the twitch in Natsu's lips, and the two found themselves squirming uncomfortably under Natsu's gaze when they recognized the twitch that for a brief second even truly resembled a smile, as sinister as it was. Dragon Slayer lost art. Chaotic void, Natsu said with a smirk, and Lucy's face drained of all color, an expression of horror striking her features closely followed by those who were on lullaby task. They all remembered the terrible feeling of their insides turning around like their stomach took a trip to roller coaster and forgot to take them. It was a feeling that you couldn't forget even if you wanted to, and the green faces of Gray and Wendy spoke it wasn't for the lack of trying. A black hole opened beneath the small group of three and both Lucy and Ritas gave a startled cry for help before the hole closed. A few seconds later Natsu emerged from a new one, amusement flickering across his obsidian eyes, no doubt witnessing Lucy and Ritas emptying their stomachs. That will do for the moment. Any sign of amusement already disappeared from his face. Where did you take them? Kana wondered, sounding somewhat angry. Somewhere. Natsu deadpanned. Right now we have more important problem at our hand. He's right. We have to stop Phantom Lord before this gets out of our hands. Urza agreed, urging others to move, but as if on cue a black cloud rose from the castle. Upon closer inspection, by closer, Urza meant the cloud moved closer, at an alarming rate at that. She realized the cloud was not the cloud at all but a mass of black shadows. The fight between the shadows that followed quickly showed two things. 1. There was a considerable amount of shadows, more than gathered fairy tale mages, and 2. You don't want to touch them. The second point was even more pronounced as Wakaba collapsed to the floor, his magic completely drained. Don't let shadows touch you. They will empty your magic container in a second. Bisca yelled. You three, Wendy and Katz, with me, Natsu barked, suddenly pointing at Urza, Gray, and Elfman before turning to the castle and quickly walking toward the small cliff that separated the beach from the water. Are we going in their guild hall? Asked Wendy as she fell into step beside him, forced to a half jog to keep up with his quick pace. The Dragon Prince nodded, stopping just at the edge of the cliff. We need to stop Jose and the robot. Elfman grinned. We're gonna fight like men. I'm a girl, Wendy reminded the white-haired male Strauss sibling. To the castle, Elfman exclaimed, pointing at the robot before jumping off of the cliff. Aye, sir. A wide grin spread over Happy's face, who spread his wings, and the Exceed dived after Strauss and warping his tail around one hand of the giant mage, grunting in an effort to lift him up for a second before the cat got a better grip on him and carried him over the water. Their manly yells drew a blank face from the four still standing at the cliff, and Natsu wondered whatever asking those two to join them was a smart move. Carla sighed before she took a hold of Wendy's dress and lifted them in the air, Urza not far behind in black wing armor. Natsu waited until they were halfway over the water before he spoke the incantation, black hole opening beneath him. With Lucy and Ritas asterisk, here, this should be far enough, Natsu said as the two fairy tale mages besides him crumbled to the floor, emptying their stomachs as soon as they opened their eyes. The violent spinning of the room almost bearable to the pain in their head and twisting of their stomach. As the two continued to wriggle on the floor, the Dragon Prince's eyes showed slight amusement, a memory of the past coming front to his mind before he disappeared from the warehouse he left them in. I hate him, Lucy said once she managed to point where the ceiling and where the floor was. Forget the point where she thought he might be a nice guy underneath all that black clothing. What he did was just mean. Ritas nodded in agreement. Should I even ask what that was? Natsu's teleportation spell, Lucy answered, pushing herself to her knees. God, she hoped she'll never experience that again. Ritas nodded in agreement and the two settled on the floor. As minutes of silence ticked by, Ritas pulled out a scratch pad and a piece of coal out of his pants. Scratch. Scratch filled the room when Cole met the paper. Do you have any idea why he took us here? Ritas asked absently. I guess he took me here to keep Phantom Lord away from me. Too bad he hadn't thought of the fact Phantom Lord has a dragon slayer as well, and your scent is quite easily distinguished. Who's there? Ritas jumped to his feet. Scratchpad and Cole discarded on the floor, and the Picto Mage pulled the brush out of the back pocket of his pants. A chuckle echoed through the room as red eyes blinked at the two from the shadows in the corner. With Natsu and the others in Phantom Lord Guild Hall *, they were walking quietly through the long hallways, not out of necessity to stay unnoticed since they didn't delude themselves that Jose was unaware of their arrival, but out of pure instinct. Natsu stopped mid-step and without a warning, which resulted in Gray almost slamming into his back. Ice User managed to stop himself just in time and glared at Dragon Slayer. Why did you stop? He hissed in annoyance. He had every right to be annoyed considering the thought of bumping into pink-haired teen scared the living daylights out of him, and it wouldn't even be his fault. Natsu looked at him before he turned his head back to the front and pointed at 5 doors that were lined on the wall. We have to separate. Going through each of those doors together would take too much time. He's got a point, Urza mused before she looked at Natsu. Who goes where? Natsu blinked at her question. It was rare for anyone to ask him for instructions. As uncommon as that was, he didn't delay with his answer. The strongest presence is coming from the middle, so I'll take those. Wendy and Katz, first. Gray, second. Urza, fourth. Elfman. Where Elman needed to go was obvious even though it was unsaid, but the reason for Natsu's sudden silence had nothing to do with that fact as a shrill scream ripped the air. Natsu and Wendy grimaced when the sound assaulted their eardrums. It's Lucy. Urza realized with wide eyes. Elfman looked at Natsu. I thought you took her somewhere safe. Natsu nodded. So did I. It appears I underestimated their ability to track people. Not a problem, though, we'll get her out. Not a problem, Gray scoffed angrily. Do you hear yourself? It came from there. Wendy pointed at the middle door, her eyes moving to Natsu. I am well aware of that, Natsu shrugged. Pointing out the obvious has no purpose whatsoever. Either way, we stick to the original plan. I'll save her when I find her. They didn't wait for any more instructions, rushing to their designated doors. Wendy looked at her strange opponent cautiously, but her curiosity was also clearly visible. Happy hovered above her, glaring at the black and white wizard who stood in their path while Carla positioned herself beside Wendy, her wings folded but still there. What is your name? Wendy questioned, moving her balance to her toes in order to attack or dodge if necessary. The man raised an eyebrow, an amused smirk on his lips. And why would I tell you that? It is a show of good manners in a fight, Wendy said. My brother believes that to be quite important, and I was trained by him. Your brother sure sounds like an idiot, man commented, but I'll amuse you, cute little thing. My name is Todomaru. Wendy bristled at the mage in front of her. Angry both for calling her little and more importantly calling her brother an idiot. Like you're the one to talk, Carla shot back, referring to the two-toned long hair that was tied in a knot. Your hairstyle sure doesn't point to you being overly smart. Black and white, really. Your sense of fashion is truly horrendouses. Wendy giggled at the face Carla made to emphasize her point. The blue-haired teen knew quite well the white cat was doing this just to mess with Phantom Lord Mage, and by the furious face of their opponents, it was working. Don't you dare mock my hair! Todomaru exclaimed, pointing an angry finger at the small cat who shrugged. It's not mocking if it's true. Todomaru's eye twitched in annoyance and yellow flames wrapped around his hand. You little brats! He moved to squash the white feline, but Wendy intercepted his path, her own hand warped in wind. Sky Dragon's crushing fang. She flexed her fingers and as if claws moved towards Todomaru, who discarded his attack in favor of dodging, quickly jumping back, but Wendy's fingers still managed to graze his hand. Todomaru hissed and pressed his other hand against the bleeding wound. The mismatched-haired man frowned at the superficial wound in his ruined sleeve. You are one annoying little gaki, aren't ya? Todomaru wondered out loud before his hands lit in yellow flames again. What in Maviz's name is that? Wendy asked as she pinched her nose, the previous encounter with the flame too short to realize it was the source of the horrible smell. Carla and Happy shared her disliking of the suspicious fire in Todomaru's hands. It stinks. Carla agreed with Wendy wholeheartedly. Aye, sir, Happy added. Todomaru laughed, unbothered by the stench, moved towards Wendy, who stepped to the side, but Todomaru twisted his body and moved to hit her in the chest. Wendy, still in the middle of her last step, stumbled when she tried to took another without regaining balance from the first. Todomaru missed as the blue-haired girl found herself on the floor with an umph. Wendy's eyes widened and she rolled to the side when a hand, this time warped in purple, slammed in the ground beside her. Stay still, Todomaru grounded out through gritted teeth as the game of tag continued. I don't think I'll do that, Wendy muttered, planting her petite hands in the wooden floor below and flipping up, her toes catching Todomaru in the chin, sending the man stumbling back and ultimately falling on the floor when Happy and Carla took hold of his legs. Wendy looked at her opponent, small sadistic glint in her eyes as she grinned at the mage. Seems like roles have been reversed. Sky Dragon's roar. Todomaru watched in morbid fascination as tornadoes stormed towards him, sending him flying through the wall behind him. Wendy quickly jumped after him, Carla and Happy following somewhat cautiously behind. She's been spending too much time with Natsu, Carla palmed her face. Duh, Happy replied. Todomaru by now regained his footing, but the roar seemed to do quite a bit of damage along with its newly creation of a hole in the wall, if the bloody chin was any indication. Wendy circled around him for a moment before they rushed at each other, yellow flames once again in Todomaru's hands and wind spiraling in Wendy's. Sky Dragon's crushing fang. Wendy chanted once again as she moved towards Todomaru, who dodged the attack. You think you can use the same trick on me twice? I'm not. As Wendy ran past him, she propelled herself in the air, her feet already coated with magic. Sky Dragon's Claw. Her feet connected with Todomaru's head, sending the man to the ground, and as Wendy moved to land and Todomaru to stand up, she crashed her other foot in his back, sending him to the floor with even more force than her previous blow provided. Don't get up, Wendy said when Todomaru blinked barely around, obviously dizzy from 2 blows and more than a bit disoriented. The blue-haired dragon slayer once again cocked her hand back but didn't bother warping magic around before she slammed her fist into Todomaru's head, sending the man to the blissful unconscious. Wendy sighed, panting slightly before she wiped her cheek where small cut stood she received during the fight. Sorry, Todomaru, but you gave me no choice, Wendy replied to the mage, perfectly aware he couldn't hear her. I don't think apologizing to the enemy is really necessary, Wendy, Happy told the bluehead. I know, Wendy smiled. But it's a nice thing to do. Carla shook her head. Are you okay? Why wouldn't I be? Wendy asked her friend, a small grin on her lips. Carla smiled back along with Happy. Natsu walked through the empty halls of Phantom Lord, mages of said guild surprisingly absent, but the Dragon Prince rationalized that they were in front of his own guild hall fighting along the shadows. He strained his hearing, searching for any foe that would dare cross his path, and as he did so it was not hard to pick the sounds of Wendy's victory. Urza's battle with Arya the Wind Mage was still going on, but it was clear Urza would emerge victorious as well. Grey has already taken down Rain Woman, Juvia was her name if Natsu remembered correctly, and the battle had a rather interesting end. Elfman's fight with Saul finished only a few moments ago, and Natsu could swear he heard Mira at some point in the battle, but that was preposterous. She was not here. How would she be? Deciding that questioning that would just lead to more questions, Natsu dropped the matter entirely, making a mental note to talk with male Strauss sibling. Black eyes focused on the hall before him once again, or more specifically on metal door that stood before him. Dragon Prince had no doubt that Lucy was on the other side of them, her strong lavender and green apple scent more than enough to ensure him. With a small, barely audible sigh, the Chaos Dragon Slayer raised his leg and slammed his foot in the metal doors, sending them crashing into the floor with a loud clang. A teenager, maybe a year or two older than himself, stared at him, only semi-surprised by the crude way of his entry. Red eyes stared at Black for a long moment before the black-haired teenager grinned, canines glinting in the light. Even if Natsu didn't saw the particular set of teeth that were more or less a dead giveaway, the man smelled of iron in a way only Dragon Slayer taught by Iron and Iron Dragon could. You're an Iron Dragon Slayer, Natsu stated after another moment, his eyes moving to Lucy, who sat on the floor behind the Dragon Slayer, looking quite shaken but also visibly relieved ever since Natsu stepped in. Gajiel Red Fox, red-eyed teen, introduced himself. You're Kira, aren't ya? I prefer Natsu Souleater, Natsu replied evenly with a nod. But Kira is also correct, I guesses. Gajiel stared at stoic teen for a moment before he chuckled, the sound not sounding particularly natural. Son of Acnologia, my ass. Metallicana said himself Acnologia would never take a human child. Gajiel looked at Natsu. He surely has one of those lacrimas implanted in himself. If you are quite done staring at me, I would like to get to the point, Natsu informed Iron Dragon Slayer dryly. You here for the Heartfilia girl? Gajiel asked with a smirk. I was under impression that was obvious. I can't give her to you, Gajiel replied. You know, orders are orders. And it's not like I actually want to either way. You don't strike me like someone who follows orders, Natsu noted. I'm not, but it's definitely more fun than watching you walk away. You want to fight me? Natsu asked curiously. People usually made a point to avoid that bit of activity with him. If their name wasn't Urza, that is. Gajiel nodded. Of course. You seem like someone that could give me a challenge. And don't worry, I'll be careful not to break too much, Lucy scoffed at him. You'll need to be careful not to provoke him too much, so you might get away with only a few bones broken. She wasn't on many missions with pink-haired Dragon Slayer, nor did she spend a large amount of time with him, but she knew he was not the one to simply knock his opponent out. Gajiel glanced at her, missing the tiny nod her reply got from Natsu, whose thoughts were going along the same line as Lucis, while also realization settled in him. No wonder Iron Dragon Slayer was so confident. He believed he could beat him. How foolish, Natsu mused. You shut up or I'll make sure you won't be able to speak ever again, Gajeel hissed, making Lucy take a step back even before his index finger that was pointed at her was covered in iron claw. A rather nasty smile stretched Lucy's lips a second later, much to Gajeel's confusion, but when booted foot slammed into the side of his face he got a good idea why the blonde smiled. While I find her constant talking annoying most of the times, cutting off her tongue seems a bit extreme, wouldn't you agree? Natsu spoke from his spot where Gajeel used to stand a few moments ago. Lucy looked at the pink-haired teen with an annoyed look in her eyes but stayed quiet, not wishing to reinforce his point. Gajeel stared at him, not bothering to hide his shock. He hadn't even heard him move and the teen sent him flying across the room and cracked his jaw in that one kick. Grunting in displeasure, the black-haired teen stood up and whipped the blood that trickled down through his mouth, a result of getting his tongue bitten with enough force from the sudden hit. "You made a big mistake, Kira," Gajeel growled, magic circle appearing beneath him. With a yell he ran at the stoic black-eyed teen, hand extending as the incantation left his lips, Iron Dragon's Club. The extended limb moved towards Natsu, who bent to the side to avoid it, and once it passed by him the Chaos Dragon Slayer latched onto the arm and with a swing sent Gajeel into the wall and trough it. Gajeel growled again as he climbed out of the hole he collapsed in and rose. "You think you can defeat me with few cheap tricks?" he asked when he noticed Natsu didn't move a step from his spot since they started. "Yeses," Natsu replied easily. "Let's see how to do you like thizzes," Gajeel muttered, his magic rising for a second before it settled again, warping his skin making the metal armor that glinted in the light. "Try breaking me now," Gajeel replied with a smirk. "My skin and bones are harder than steel." A small smirk settled on Natsu's lips, a rather disturbing sigh if Lucy was asked, and the black eyes slitted, the usual round shape gone. "As big as a waste of my time you proved to be rather amusing," Natsu noted, flexing his fingers. Gajeel scoffed at Pinkhead and rushed at him, arm again turned into the club, but this time instead of dodging, Natsu warped his own hand in black and blue chaos energy. Chaos Dragon's Iron Fist. Natsu slammed his bandage-warped fist into the club, making Gajeel stop, unable to push forward and also wondering if the crack he heard meant his hand was broken. It certainly felt like it. Before he could contemplate the possibility that never before occurred, Natsu twisted his upper body and slammed his foot in the club, forcing Gajeel to kneel in order to avoid having his arm broken any further as Natsu pushed it to the ground. Chaos Dragon's Wing Attack. Natsu jumped in the air and swung his outstretched arms, the energy moving towards Gajeel at an alarming rate. With a grunt he rolled out of the way, the spell catching his right leg, effectively destroying his pants and boot, and he knew it was only thanks to the metal scales covering his skin that he still had his leg, as mangled as it was. Not the one to give up, the Iron Dragon Slayer took a deep breath, preparing to blast Natsu, who was walking towards him as far as possible. The fact Natsu stopped walking and also took a deep breath somewhat alarming. Iron Dragon's Roar. Gajeel roared at Pinkhead, who released his own roar a moment later. The two roars crashed together, though Gajeel's was ridiculously easy to overpower. The roar picked him from the ground and sent him crashing yet again through the wall, but this time he wasn't so sure he would be able to get up. "Shit," he muttered, his eyes fixed on his arms. He managed to bring in the fort of his face, not a second before the roar hit him. The iron scales were ripped apart, showing his badly mangled arms that were missing a rather large chunk of meat on them. Not something fatal and something that would be able to heal over time, but it definitely hurt like hell. He was brought out of his pained thoughts when a hand grabbed his leg and dragged him over the debris left by his forced passage through the wall. The fact scales on his back weren't in any better shape than those on his arms didn't help, as a random piece of wood managed to stab itself just below his shoulder blade. He soon found himself staring into black slitted eyes of his opponent, insufferable smirk that bordered on insane still on Natsu's face as he grabbed a handful of Gajeel's hair and lifted the teen up into a sitting position. "Should I gouge your eyes out or tongue? I heard both are quite painful, especially if you do it slowly," Natsu questioned mildly, seemingly talking to himself. Gajeel's eyes widened slightly. He realized Natsu was stronger after the second hit he took, a serious blow to his pride since he doubted Natsu even knew how Acnologia looked. That being said, he definitely didn't plan to die in this fight or any fight anytime soon, but the pink-haired menace before him didn't seem to share his plans. "Natsu," Lucy called out to her guildmate carefully, half expecting he would turn on her if she interrupted him, but she also wouldn't appreciate him torturing the black-haired teen in front of her even if he was an overconfident idiot. Natsu looked at her, slitted eyes blank as ever, and after a second, much to her and Gajeel's surprise, he let the black-haired teen go, the said teen crashing into the ground with pain. OMPF. I won't kill you now, Natsu informed the downed slayer who struggled to stay conscious. I try not to kill fellow kin if I don't have to, but make no mistake that I would have any problem doing it if you give me another reason. Gajil gave a small chuckle that was interrupted by a cot. People had no idea how accurate they were when they named you Soulless Fairy. Probably, Natsu didn't deny before he raised his leg once more and crashed it into Gajil's head, sending the man into the blissful unconscious. The pink-haired teen turned to Lucy, who squirmed under the slitted gaze, thankful and relieved when black orbs turned round once again. Are you alright? Came the question, surprising her slightly. Natsu truly couldn't care less, but spending so much time with Mira and Wendy gave him some semblance of manners. Yeses, Lucy replied after a moment as Natsu moved behind her to untie her hands bound behind her back. Blonde couldn't help but flinch when she felt freezingly cold hands brush against her skin. Natsu moved his recently clawed finger through the thick ropes, easily cutting through it. Lucy frowned when something wet dripped on her hand before the rope came loose. She brought her hands to her chest to rub her sore wrist but stopped, her eyes fixed on the dark red, almost black drop of something that trickled down. She reluctantly sniffed it in confusion. Cooper. Blood. Natsu supplied her with the answer, making the blonde turn to him. A small gasp escaped her lips when she saw Natsu looking at his own left hand curiously, the same dark blood soaking the black bandages and the sleeve of his shirt, slowly dripping to the floor. Are you alright? Lucy asked uncertainly. He didn't seem to be in pain, though it was hard to say considering she couldn't note anything different in his facial expression aside from barely notable curiosity as he flexed the hand. Why wouldn't I be? Natsu looked at her, sounding genuinely confused by her question. Lucy's sweat dropped. Yay. Why indeed? We better get. Natsu was stopped from finishing his sentence as something crashed in the side of his face with enough force to send him flying. Natsu. Lucy cried out in shock while Dragon Slayer picked himself out of the rubbish he found himself in. Natsu didn't answer but simply turned slightly annoyed glare at the direction of his attacker. Kukuku. His attacker chuckled as he stepped forward, out of the shadows he was hiding for. A fist made out of shadows stretched above him for a moment longer before it disappeared, though it gave Natsu a very good idea who his attacker was. So the original was beaten by a fake. I would have said how original, but I find it rather corny. Natsu raised his eyebrow at amused Phantom Lord Master. Fake. Jose's grin widened while Lucy stepped back, unsure what to do. She was not deluding herself, she could compete with someone of Jose's or Natsu's level, yet she felt like she needed to help somehow. Why yes, fake. You are a fake Dragon Slayer and therefore I called you fake. There is no way Acnologia would raise a human. Acnologia is dead for hundreds of years now anyway. Natsu's eyebrow twitched and his eyes narrowed. So much about helping him, Lucy mused dryly. He's going to raise Jose along with his entire guild hall. Jose's smug grin was short-lived, however, when Natsu ran at him, so fast that Jose would have missed if he had blinked, certainly not slow enough for Phantom Lord Master to dodge. The iron fist of the Chaos Dragon crashed into his stomach, sending him flying. It was only his years of experience that managed to put his mind together in order before he crashed that allowed him to gather enough coherent thought to form another shadowy hand that caught him, making his fall much more pleasant than it would have been if he went through the wall behind him. Natsu didn't wait for Jose to regain his bearings and charged again. Leg raised to kick him in the head, though Jose managed to catch the quick attack by the still-formed shadow. A quick exchange of kicks and fists followed, and the several few hits that connected with his hands and shin instead of shadow libs circling around him made Jose's teeth rattle. Natsu pressed the man, using both regular punches and kick along with magic reinforced ones. When 20 shadow fists rose from the ground and went after him, the Chaos Dragon Slayer jumped back but didn't stop his attack. Chaos Dragon's roar. Jose's eyes widened when his attempt to push persistent Pinkhead back backfired on him, and now he was faced by the tornado of black and blue energy the size of a grown man. Shadowy hands twisted in an urgent attempt to shield himself and formed a wall in front of Jose, but he quickly found out that it won't be enough as the roar pushed against his defenses, struggling only briefly to break the hastily twisted shield. With a cry of pain, Jose was driven into the ground. I will not lose to Jose's threat, replay or whatever his next sentence should have been, was promptly silenced with Natsu's foot in his mouth. Be quiet while I rip your hands out of their sockets, Natsu said in a conversational tone and flexed his fingers, a sadistic glint forming in his black eyes, once again slitted. Jose's own eyes widened when Natsu grasped his frantically waving hands, incredibly strong grip on his arms almost enough to break the bones on its own. Natsu removed his foot from man's mouth and placed it on his chest. Jose gritted his teeth in frustration as he grounded out the incantation, barely capable of drawing enough breath to do so. Ghost push. Shadows rose from the ground around the two and rushed at Natsu, managing to push him back off of Jose only due to their overwhelming number and sudden appearance. Natsu growled at his enemy, hands already warped in chaos energy as he slammed them into the ghosts that lingered long enough to try and attack. The distraction they caused left Jose with an opening he didn't have during the entire fight. Dead wave. Phantom Lord Master thrusted his hands forward, new shadows rising and twisting around his hands before they were fired at the Dragon Slayer, ripping and tearing the already heavily damaged floor before them. Lucy gaped at the scene, Natsu's name already on her lips to warn him, but instead, she grounded her teeth and jumped at Dragon Slayer. She crashed into Natsu, whose eyes went wide at the sudden human contact, and the two crashed against the wall, spell passing behind them, missing them by an inch. Jose stared stupidly at his failed attempt to hit the Dragon Slayer. The master completely forgot the blonde was there. Natsu found himself in a rather awkward position, lying in the pile of rubble that decorated the edges of the devastated room, with Lucy lying on top of him, her chest pushed in his head. "If you wouldn't mind getting off of me," Black-Eyed Dragon Slayer commented when Lucy didn't move for a second. The blonde blushed fiercely at that and tried to scramble to her feet, but unable to take footing in her position. With a sigh and more than a little awkward, the Dragon Prince jerkily pushed the blonde off of himself, Lucy falling with a yelp to the side. Natsu stood up in a second and dusted himself, hardly believing the blonde actually pushed him. He was perfectly capable of deflecting that attack. "Thank you very much. Don't do that again," he advised the blonde that managed to sit up only to glare at him. "Is that a way to say thank you to someone who wanted to help you?" she demanded. "No." Natsu deadpanned but didn't move to help her stand up or continue their short conversation, turning to Jose, who was still stupidly staring at them. "Shall we continue?" The Dragon Prince wondered and began his advance towards Jose, who swallowed and prepared himself for round two. If the stoic teen was stronger than him, and Jose was not admitting he was, he probably just had a bad day and the teenager got lucky. He will use some more underhanded methods to win. "So tell me, how did a fake like you came to an idea to call himself the son of Acnologia?" Jose taunted with a grin. Natsu blinked at him, not looking any angrier than he was a moment ago. "You must like the idea quite a bit if you still proclaim it like that, even though everyone believes you're just a liar." Natsu's eyebrow twitched before he rushed at Jose, who grinned triumphantly, spells already forming. Dark. The fist in his jaw was rather unexpected considering Natsu was several feet in front of him only a few seconds prior, and now he was standing in front of him. The master would have fallen on his bottom from the hit, but Dragon Slayer grabbed his throat. "Any last words?" Natsu asked and squeezed a little tighter, making the man wheeze and gasp for breath. Monster." Jose spat at Dragon Slayer, the spit hitting the Dragon Prince just above his right eyebrow. Lucy froze at the sight, practically able to feel the cold fury now building in Natsu as he started squeezing tighter. "Dragon Slayer secret art. Black Executioner." Lucy watched in utter horror as the words rolled down Natsu's tongue, the tone of his voice completely different yet disturbingly the same, double-layered as it was. "Natsu, stop this instant." The booming voice of Makarov almost made Lucy cry in relief, and by the looks of it Jose wasn't far either. Natsu tensed, the aura of darkness that started spreading around him disappearing in a blink, almost like he wasn't aware it was there until now. Makarov walked towards Pinkhead, who still held Jose tightly, claws on his left hand digging into the skin on the pale man's neck. "And a valid reason for such a foolish act?" Natsu questioned, and Makarov had to stop himself from pinching the bridge of his nose. "Fairy Tail members are not killers," Makarov informed the Dragon Slayer with a scowl on his face. "Does that mean I'm not a Fairy Tail member?" Natsu asked, genuinely curious about the fact. Makarov sighed heavily and shook his head. "You are a member of Fairy Tail? Then don't claim what is not true," Natsu responded and released the hold on Jose's neck, letting the man collapse to the ground and wheezing for breath. Makarov looked around the room with another sigh, relieved to see Lucy unharmed and somewhat curious of the teenager unconscious in one corner. A resounding crack echoed through the quiet room, and Makarov's eyes snapped to the Dragon Slayer, who had his eyes fixed on his hands, an uncharacteristic frown set on his face. It didn't take Master long to figure out where that crack had come from, considering Natsu's right arm that was not covered by the sleeve looked like shattered glass. Too much magic, Natsu muttered to himself and sighed before he looked up, Lucy and Makarov both staring at the almost black blood trailing down his both hands. Not bothering to explain himself to them or reassure the two, Natsu took a fistful of what reminded of Jose's coat and lifted the man from the ground, getting a quiet yelp in response from him. "We have better things to do instead of you two gawking at me like circus attraction." Makarov and Lucy blinked and nodded. After a moment, Master walking to one of the holes in the wall that used to separate outside with indoors. Natsu was ready to jump into the water with Jose over his shoulder, almost 100 feet below, but Makarov's hand stopped him. "You've done enough today, my boy. Let me carry the traitorous master and carry you two acrosses." Lucy looked somewhat puzzled by the offer, but realization quickly came when Makarov stepped out, using Titan magic immediately and within a second standing on the bottom of the ocean, tall enough for two mages to easily reach him. Lucy settled on his shoulder and Natsu next to her, his back tense and obviously uncomfortable with his current situation. When he went to the window to jump, he had no intention reaching the water's bellow but simply opening the void. With Master's offer he couldn't really use the excuse, "I had to use it," when he tried to explain Wendy the state of his hands. He looked at them again, fighting back a grimace when he noticed the skin on his right hand peeling off, black scales glinting underneath. "That looks quite painful," Lucy commented as they made their way toward the shore, the fight between members and ghosts over once Jose was defeated. Natsu wondered how to respond to that, or even if he should. Seeing no real harm in it, he replied, "It's not, at least not to me. I have high pain tolerance, still doesn't look pleasant," Lucy half whispered, half said before the blonde continued, "Is it permanent?" "Quite. Ouch." Natsu shrugged, not willing and not knowing how to respond to that. It really didn't pain him as much as it would someone else. They reached the shore moments later and the two jumped down from Master's shoulder and the man shrunk to his midget size again. Jose promptly dropped on the ground, making the man grumble but unwilling to do much in order to escape. He knew he couldn't and he had no intention angering the pink-haired menace that was looking at him. "Lucy, Natsu, are you alright?" Urza spoke to them first as the Titania approached, bruised and with split lip but looking relatively unharmed. "Yes, thanks to him I am," Lucy said with a smile. "Thanks to him," Jose scoffed and was probably going to speak further if Natsu didn't slam his knee into the man's head. "Shut up," the dragon deadpanned. "Brother." Natsu looked up and almost sighed in exasperation at Wendy's terror-filled expression. "Are you alright, Wendy?" he asked instead. Wendy glared at him, though the effect was quite lessened by the tears that threatened to spill from her already watered eyes. "You were going to use a secret art, am I right?" Wendy whispered as she moved to her brother, soft green glow warping around her fingers. Natsu nodded somewhat awkwardly and frowned slightly when he noticed a tear trailing down Wendy's face. With a sigh, the Dragon Slayer cupped Wendy's chin and lifted her head up so she would face him. "Now what did we say about crying?" Natsu asked his little sister, who sniffed. "No crying over stupid reasons," Wendy whispered before she glared at him again, green glow disappearing as she stomped on the ground angrily, accidentally letting a burst of magic that sent the wind around them, attracting even more attention. "But this isn't a stupid reason, Natsu. Dragonification has started and you should be more careful. You know how dangerous." She stopped mid-sentence when she became aware of the dry look Natsu was pointing at her. The young girl looked at the gathered guild members around them, all staring at the duo. "Dragonification?" Makarov asked with a frown. "It's already started, Wendy." Natsu turned to her, ignoring the others at the moment. "There will be time to deal with them later. There is nothing I can do to stop it, and if I don't use my magic it will only take a few weeks more before it's complete. Would you just start explaining?" Urza demanded when she realized the Dragon Prince was done talking. "You can't expect us to just ignore whatever dragonification is. If it's dangerous for you we could maybe help." "You can't," Natsu replied simply. "And about explaining it, I will do that, but once the guild hall is repaired." Urza frowned at that. "And why not now? Leave it be, Urza." It was surprisingly Gray's advice. "If the black bastard plans on telling anything he will tell it only when he feels like it." Natsu frowned at the insult, so instead of staying quiet as was he intentionally planned, he added, "Snowman is right." Gray glared at the pink-haired teen and would have sworn he was looking smug. The small crowd of gathered mages stayed quiet for a moment until Mira stepped out, looking quite bruised herself. "You were in a fight?" Natsu asked when she walked to him. The white-haired beauty smiled at him. Yup. Though Elfman rescued me. Natsu's eyes looked over the crowd and settled on the giant of a man who gulped when he found a pair of slitted eyes on him. And why were you in a fight? Saul tried to use me against Elfman, Mira pouted. The nerve of that man. Elfman paled slightly while Natsu's eyes narrowed. But enough about me, Mira replied cheerfully, though her eyes stayed fixed on the hands still covered in black blood. That needs to be warped up, she stated. I know, Natsu replied, hiding the confusion he felt at that statement. Of course, he knew that. Why was Mira pointing out the obvious? I have some bandages at my place so you could go with me home, Mira offered, making the rest of the guild drop their jaws. But Mira, he'll know where we live, Elfman exclaimed before he could stop himself. The dual glare now sent his way did nothing to calm white-haired teenager's nerves, and the heel that hit him in the head did not help. Mira scoffed at him and took off her second heel, unable to stand properly with only one on. I think all passes, Natsu said with a small smile, barely visible on his lips. I wouldn't want Elfman sleeping with one eye open for the rest of his life. Elfman could do little but gave in, as the second heel hit him in the stomach. He won't mind, Mira persisted. Please, still, I think all passes, Natsu responded and looked around as the guild members around them practically leaned closer to hear them better. He leaned slightly towards Mira, making her blush. Though you could always come to my house. Mira brightened up at the proposal while the guild once again could only gape in shock. Lead the way, Mira stated with a grin. Natsu smiled, the smile barely visible before his eyes turned to Wendy. Wanna come with us? Mira could use a healer. I'm not that hurt. Mira protested with a smile, obviously not truly caring whatever or not the blue-haired girl would go with them. Wendy looked at her brother, somewhat surprised but pleased he invited her, and quickly jogged to the two. Well, that means we're coming too, Carla told the three while Happy cheered behind her. Sleepover at Natsu's. Natsu's face remained blank at that, unsure how to respond to that, and once again the first "this" that came to his mind didn't sound quite appropriate. No, he said instead to the cats. Happy gaped and Carla glared at him, but he quickly continued before they could speak. Find a place to sleep, cause you probably wouldn't like my way of traveling. Carla and Happy didn't need elaborating as they walked away without a word. Later that night are we there yet? Mira whined as she pulled her leg out of another hole in the ground where, by the looks of it, the grass and roots tried to keep it. The last 2 hours were very similar to this. Ever since they stepped into deeper parts of the forest, it seemed that Acnologia was hundreds of miles away. The environment and even temperature were drastically different. Wendy laughed silently, though she was not too far to ask the same question, again. She looked at Natsu, that managed to make the walking through the pathless woods they found himself in, gracious. It was quite obvious he was used to this sort of terrain. Yes, we're, Natsu said, not bothering to turn back as he ducked under a branch Wendy didn't even notice hanging there until then. If you allowed me to take you there, chaotic void, we would have already been there. I would rather walk another 2 hours. Wendy huffed through. A smile stretched her lips when she caught Natsu's quiet. I should have just grabbed you and pulled you through. Don't think you can use the same trick that you used on Lucy to work on yous, Wendy admonished her brother, though the smile was still present. And besides, Mira and I would kick your ass for doing that, the moment we could stand straight, that is. Mira laughed at the comment, though her eyebrows knitted together in slight confusion, missing Natsu's sentence, so unable to connect Wendy's with anything. But quickly the confusion disappeared and she looked at Natsu. Bastard, she said with a grin. This time Natsu did stop and turn around to face them. Watch it, he said with a voice so dry it almost made Mira thirsty. I could still use it on myself and leave you two on your own. I could always sniff our way out, Wendy countered. The small twitch in Natsu's lips, a smirk if you will, was left unseen because of the almost non-existing light around them, and the girls could only silhouette of the dragon slayer in front of them. Try it. If it wasn't Natsu who was talking to them, girls would swear there was a mischievous tone to his otherwise blank voice. Wendy raised her eyebrow in question but did as Natsu instructed. After a moment she frowned and looked at Natsu. I can't smell anything other than our immediate area. What did you do? Mira gave a curious look to the pink-haired teenager whose teeth flashed in small light, almost as if the small grin passed his face. I've learned a thing or two in my life. The least I can do is make this place hidden from people that don't know what to look and mask the scent once the wards are passed. That's why no one knows where you live, Wendy realized. And why there is no path. I don't walk all this way very often, Natsu said with a nod before he turned and started walking again. Chaotic void, Mira spoke, not as a question or seeking for confirmation. It was obvious that was the way he got home considering he used the spell every morning to appear in front of the bar for his morning fix of coffee. How does that spell work if you don't mind me asking? Not at all, Natsu replied, almost sounding genuinely pleased. How familiar are you with time-space spells? Not much, Mira shrugged, almost falling over one root that stuck out of the ground though Wendy thankfully caught her elbow and pulled her to her feet. Not surprising, Natsu gave a small shrug with one shoulder. Anyway, when I open the portal it takes me to a small pocket dimension, something like tunnels. Let's go with that. Anyway, trough that I can move to where I want, under condition I can see the place or have already been there. Wendy blanched at that. But we didn't see anything and the time it takes you to reappear is only a few seconds. She referred to her trip at the Oshibana station. Only the caster can see the tunnels and the time in the tunnels is different. The laws of physics and common sense as you know it does not apply to the tunnels, Natsu explained. So all the side effects and the like, how do you even carry so many people around with you? Rather simply, you follow me, you walk through you are not aware of it. It was kind of creepy to know that and both Mira and Wendy agreed without a word spoken between them. Headaches, nausea and everything else is because of that. Well partly though it is mostly caused by the passage through the dimensions, that makes some, weird, twisted sense. I guess, Mira said finally. Why don't you have headaches, and everything else? The white-haired girl wondered. I did at the beginning when I started learning the spell but if you use it enough times the side effects start weakening until they are completely gone. Interesting, Wendy muttered. So if we use the spell enough times we would get rid of the pain? Yeses, Natsu nodded, stepping over another root and immediately ducking under a low-hanging branch. Wendy and Mira followed him and immediately stopped afterward when they realized they were standing at the edge of a small clearing. The grass underneath their feet almost looked silver underneath moonlight that was now more visible when the thick treetops weren't hanging over their heads. In the center of the clearing stood a small cottage. A tree that it seemed to have been built around pushed its roots through the bottom and branches through the roof but the bricks were built in a way that didn't leave any holes in the small house. A chimney decorated the other side taking the large part in the middle of the small wall. Is that your house? Wendy asked in awe at the pretty picture the site produced. Natsu just looked at her with a dry look that Wendy recognized as one of those he gave her when she asked a stupid question. It was a funny thing really, no one would even notice the difference between his usual expression but the small changes he made to his facial expression were more or less obvious to Wendy. Of course, Wendy blushed. Well, are you going to get inside or gawk at my house for the rest of the night? Natsu raised his eyebrow at the two who nodded and the three continued. Whatever they expected to find when Natsu opened the doors of his house was not the sparkly clean room. Mira and Wendy looked around the small house in wonder. The living room they were standing in was connected with a small kitchen that was separated with L-shaped counters, a stove and small fridge pushed against the wall next to counters and a sink in one of the counters. The living room had a two-seat sofa facing a fireplace and in front of the sofa stood a large suitcase that seemed to be used like a coffee table if the lone plate and empty coffee cup on it was anything to go by. Behind the sofa hung the hammock that must have been dubbed as a bed because there were only doors for bathroom left in the house. The hammock was tied between the wall and small wardrobe. I'll go and take a shower if you don't mind, Natsu informed them going to the wardrobe and pulling a pair of baggy black pants and underwear out of it. You can search for something to eat in the fridge. I'm not sure if there is anything but you could always make some coffee. With that the pink-haired dragon slayer left the girls alone in his living room and went into the bathroom, the doors closing without a sound. Two girls looked at each other, not sure what to do but after the water started running in the bathroom Wendy moved to the kitchen part of the room and opened the fridge, looking unimpressed at the moldy cheese and some bread that looked old but not old enough to be inedible. Well, that's underwhelming. Wendy sighed and her stomach growled. Mira looked through the counters, finding pretty much only enough for one of them, one plate, one cup, one spoon. No kidding, Mira sighed. I knew I should have made him go to my house. I have some pie from yesterday we could have been eating 2 hours ago. Wendy pouted at that before she pulled out the bread. Hungry? She showed Mira the bread and the white-haired girl made a face. Yes, but I don't think I could eat it just like that considering it's probably harder than a hammer. Wendy tried to push her finger in it but only chuckled when it wouldn't budge. Talk about old. She stored the bread in the fridge that she realized was not even turned on and closed the doors. He's really not often here, is he? Well, I do eat at the guild when I'm in Magnolia. Natsu spoke to them as he stepped out of the bathroom, black baggy pants on him but everything else of his trademark outfit missing, gray towel cast over his shoulders and water dripping from his still wet hair. Mira blushed at the sight. Dear Mavis, he's hot. Myra's blush deepened as she looked at her hands. Why am I thinking that now? He's always hot. The white-haired mage frowned and shook his head. So not the direction I wanted my thoughts to go. Natsu looked at Mira somewhat curiously, seeing her red face but discarded it quickly. She's a girl. Girls blush and he's half naked. He looked at the wardrobe wondering if he should have bothered getting the shirt wet with his hair to stop Mira from overheating. She does look cute. Though, Natsu would have looked horrified if he didn't lack the facial muscles to pull it off. The dragon prince shook his head and turned to the fireplace, putting the few logs inside on fire with a match he pulled from the box nearby. Wendy couldn't help but grin at the sight of the two as she moved and sat in the sofa. The light in the house was not well, only the little that came from windows, but she doubted Natsu was ever bothered by it, knowing her brother could see in the dark almost as well as during the day. He was probably only lightening that fireplace because of the two of them. As the fire got brighter and bigger, Myra's blushing face paled considerably. Natsu's torso and back were covered in scars. Big and small, narrow and wide. The biggest one was positioned right over his heart, the skin jagged and deformed. His arms were warped in bandages, both of them, and it didn't take a genius to figure out it had something to do with dragonification. Where did you get all those scars? Mira blurted out before she could stop herself and started mentally kicking herself for that. Way to go, Mira, she scolded herself. Natsu blinked at her, not seeing what the big deal was. After a moment of contemplating how to elaborate, he spoke. Most of them are from my training with father. What in the hell did he made you fight? Since the cat was out of the bag, she might as well satisfy her curiosity. Wendy bit her lower lip and looked at her lap, making Mira unsure if she knew the answer or didn't want to know it. Dragons, demons, all that stuff I told you about, Natsu explained. Though most of them are gained from punishments. I was quite a failure as a dragon slayer in father's opinion. Whatever Mira expected to hear that wasn't, well, that. Natsu was probably the strongest wizard she knew, and while he and Gildarts never fought, she had little doubt who would win. Natsu stared at the fire, lost in thoughts as the memories of his childhood came back. He shook his head to clear his mind and threw another log into the fire. Have you found something to eat? Natsu changed the subject as he stood up and walked to the wardrobe, pulling on a gray shirt over his hair. Old bread and moldy cheese, Wendy replied, making a face. Natsu stared at his sister for a moment before she sighed exasperatedly. We can't eat those. Are you certain? Natsu asked skeptically. You aren't just being picky again? Wendy blushed. No, I mean yes. No, I'm not picky, and yes, I'm certain. Mira laughed after a second, but don't worry. We can get through one night without food. The bandages are above the sink in bathroom, Natsu said to Wendy, who looked at him curiously. Where are you going? To get some food for you two picky humans, Natsu replied and promptly disappeared through the hole that opened beneath him. Wendy laughed and stood up, walking towards the bathroom while Mira took a place at the sofa. Wendy returned a moment later carrying a roll of white bandages and moved to warp them around few shallow cuts on Myra's arms that before healing the bruises. He had it quite rough when he was a kid, Mira spoke into the silence. Wendy nodded. More than he lets on, no doubt. You don't think any less of him? Wendy asked as she looked at white-haired girl seriously. No, Mira immediately replied. Why would I? Just asking. Wendy smiled. Do you know how was he punished? Mira couldn't help but ask. Wendy shook her head. He doesn't talk about it. Mira nodded in understanding. It was only half an hour later when Natsu reappeared with a very familiar-looking pie in his hands. Mira looked at him wide-eyed. How? Where did? You went to my house and nearly scared the living daylights out of your brother, Natsu confirmed as he placed the pie in front of the girls and moved to the counters, taking a plate and a bowl from it, giving it to the two girls. You won't eat? Mira asked as she cut the piece of pie out for Wendy. I'm not hungry. Natsu shrugged off the question and sat on the floor since the girls had taken the sofa and that was more or less the only sitting place in the house. Do you want that I change your bandages, Natsu? I just put them on, Natsu replied as he straightened his back. Something Wendy recognized as his back off stance. Since it wasn't accompanied by the usual glare, she decided to try once again. You only put new ones on your right arm. Wendy eyed the said arm, the number of bandages around them considerably less than on his left where they reached almost his shoulder. Natsu glanced at Mira, who was eyeing the two over the edge of her plate, a forkful of pie halfway to her lips. It's alright, Wendy, Natsu said again. You've been using your magic all day and I'm sure you're exhausted. Nonsense, Wendy smiled cheerfully as she took the bandages off of the table where she left them after she was done with Mira. The young dragon slayer quietly fingered the edge of the bandages and started unwarping them, biting her lower lip when her fingers brushed against hard scales that were replacing the skin, making the transition area jagged and overall not quite pretty. Mira watched with her eyes widening by the second as Wendy revealed Natsu's arm, black scales and red lines covering his arm. His fingernails were replaced by a set of claws, sharp as a razor. Natsu sat in front of Wendy on the floor, looking at Wendy, curious to see her reaction. The young girl glared at the scales but her eyes watered. This is going a lot faster than you said it would, Wendy accused, wondering if her healing spell would be of any help. She looked over the hand one more time, frowning when she noticed a piece of skin already looking ready to peel, black scales shining underneath. I've been forced to use more magic lately than I thought I would, Natsu responded evenly, his eyes moving to Mira, who was gaping at him. Is that dragonification? Mira questioned uncertainly. Natsu nodded. The beginning of it, he confirmed. Wendy warped the bandages around the arm, mindful of the claws in order to keep them from tearing the bandages as soon as they are applied. Mira was now the one chewing her lower lip. It was obvious Natsu didn't want to talk about it, and neither did Wendy. She sighed and dropped it. It was not hers to pry. She will find out when the two will be ready to talk. She eyed Natsu. Soon, hopefully, with a yawn, Wendy secured the bandages. Tired, Natsu stood up and looked at Wendy, who looked at him, the pink-haired teen now towering over her since he was standing and she still sat on the sofa. I'll try to find you 2 blankets. I should have something in the closet, Natsu muttered and walked to the small wardrobe. Wendy yawned again and glanced at the clock above the fridge. 1:45 a.m. This was a long day. Natsu returned with 2 blankets a moment later, Wendy already barely awake. Mira smiled warmly at the brunette, moving her fingers through Wendy's hair. You want to take the sofa or hammock? Natsu asked Mira quietly. Sofa will be good, Mira replied, thinking she and Wendy will share the small 2-seat. She was somewhat surprised when Natsu gently hooked his arms underneath Wendy and lifted the girl, who cracked an eye open him. Wah, why doin'? Carrying you to a bed, Natsu replied as he set the girl in the hammock and pulled the blanket over her shoulders. Good night, big brother, Wendy mumbled as she snuggled with the blanket. Good night, little dragoness, Natsu whispered to her, removing a stray lock of hair from her face. You really care about her, don't you? Mira wasn't really sure why she was asking that, since she knew he does, but the stoic dragon slayer seemed so human now she couldn't remember the last time she saw that. Natsu looked up from Wendy and turned to Mira. Yes, he answered after a long water. Mira smiled before she yawned herself. This was a long day. Natsu nodded in agreement but didn't say anything as he watched Mira's eyes close. Natsu stayed silent as he sat on the floor, back against the back of the sofa, facing Wendy and with Mira behind him. He listened as their breathing evened out, the two slipping into deep sleep. Good night, love, Natsu muttered, and as if on cue the fire in the fireplace gave one last spark before it died down, leaving only ember. Black eyes stared into the burning throat of a volcano. Weird was the picture before him, he had to admit. The colors too bright and the shadows too dark. Sounds drifted through his sensitive ears, breathing, loud and steady above him. That didn't make sense. The boy gazed at the volcano closer, carefully examining the explosion in the lava before throwing a rock himself. Still, breathing remained the only sound. It was too loud to his liking, but that didn't make sense. There was nothing above him, he was sure, and besides, he couldn't look up. The bright colors of the lava beneath too mesmerizing. A cough, again above him. The boy frowned and looked up. The ground spun and the black sky darkened. The boy stumbled back and was sure he would tumble down the sides of the volcano, but only ended up sitting on the blackened dirt that stretched around him, volcano nowhere in sight. The boy looked up, not questioning too much the weird change, wondering what was above him. Took you long enough, brat, a dragon spoke above him, great fire dancing and covering his skin. Took me long enough to do what? The boy was confused. The dragon looked at him with dry amusement and opened its mouth. Boy's eyes widened as the burning inferno rushed at him, the roar of a fire dragon hot and searing. The boy rolled out of the way and jumped to his feet, realizing his clothes was in shreds. He turned to the dragon, who laughed, flames replaced by shining metal scales. Fight! The dragon bellowed and slammed its clawed paw in the green grass they stood on, metal spikes shooting from the ground and rushing at the boy. The boy jumped and spun around, ready to fight the dragon. Chaos Dragon's wing attack. The attack hit the white feathers of the female dragon and she roared in anger and pain. Stop it, human. The boy landed and faced once again the fire dragon, who looked at him from its lying position, the flames noticeably dimmer than they were. The boy found himself on his own knees, panting heavily. Why couldn't he breathe? You won, the fire dragon informed him. Will you kill me like you did everyone else? The boy looked at the dragon in confusion, but the dragon gestured to the boy to look down. The boy did as he was told, finding himself sitting on the pile of bones and rotten bodies of dragons. I was told to do that, the boy informed the dragon. But I can't do that to you, the dragon raised a flaming eyebrow. How so? I can't move, boy answered truthfully, the bones beneath him held him still like chains. Why? The boy frowned and looked at his hands, only to find himself sitting on the barren earth again. Because you fought well, I can't move just like you can't, boy realized. Indeed, will you be my friend? The boy wondered. Will I? The dragon looked confused. I guess I will, the dragon responded after a moment of silence. The boy smiled slightly, but the smile quickly disappeared, replaced by horror as the sneering face of the black dragon now in front of him. You failed, the dragon sneered, the birds in the trees around them scattering. It was too bright, I told you to kill him. I couldn't do it, father. The boy cried desperately. Please spare him, I was too weak to defeat him. He has the right to live. He's my friend. A friend? Father scoffed. A reason more to kill him. Friends are a weakness, Natsu. I told you that many times. The dragon took flight, ignoring the screaming son behind him. Father, please, don't kill him. Atlas Flame doesn't deserve it. He's strong. Natsu jerked up, panting as he did so, and gripped the back of the sofa, glad to find himself back in his cottage. His vision was blurry and the cold sweat trailed down his back, but he quite quickly found himself staring at Myra's concerned face, Wendy standing right behind her. Shit, he deduced when they kept staring at him. They must have seen him tossing around. Are you alright? Wendy finally spoke as she watched Natsu's eyes focus and the panic in them disappearing like the doors have been shut between his soul and eyes. Whoever claimed eyes were the windows to the soul never met her brother, Wendy was sure. Of course, Natsu said and pushed himself to his feet, Mira and Wendy taking a step back to give him enough space to do so. Just another nightmare, another. Wendy frowned. He never mentioned anything about nightmares. Mira studied Natsu's face while the dragon slayer climbed to his feet. Do you wanna talk about it? Natsu stayed quiet for a moment, flabbergasted by the proposal, not that it showed in anything but a twitch of his fingers, but soon responded, his voice deadpan. No. With that, the dragon prince excused himself and walked to the bathroom, closing the doors behind him. Mira and Wendy exchanged a look. They wouldn't notice something was wrong if Natsu hadn't started clawing at the back of the sofa, eyes scrunched and breathing panicked. It was what woke Mira after all, and she was in pain herself when she was almost knocked from the sofa she lied on when Natsu punched a hole through it. Both girls, almost as if they were thinking the same thing, looked at the sofa's damaged back. How the rest of the house didn't look like this, considering it was another nightmare, was beyond them. The small house fell into silence for a while, with only rushing water in the other room humming in the background. I wonder what he was dreaming about, Mira whispered once the two settled down on the sofa, since neither got anything better to do. Wendy hummed in agreement. He never mentioned he had nightmares. Mira looked at the younger girl in wonder. But you two spent weeks on missions together. I did back before. Mira stopped and swallowed. How come you never heard or seen anything? I mean, it's not like you were always sleeping in the inn with separate rooms, Wendy shrugged. He somehow hid it if he ever had nightmares while we were together. The young healer fell silent, seemingly in deep thought. It could be dragonification thing. Mira parted her lips to ask, but closed them soon after. It was not her place to pry. The water abruptly stopped in the other room, and moments later Natsu stepped out fully dressed in his usual black getup, scarf and colorful necklace around his neck. You ready to go back to the guild? Natsu asked the two as he straightened his already straight shirt, the only sign he was uncomfortable. Stoic Teen stared at the two waiting for an answer as they both quickly stood and nodded. Yup, all ready. Wendy grinned at her brother, unsure how but set on cheering him up. Not that he will show it, but Wendy could tell when he was happy. The blue-haired girl glanced at Mira and Wendy quickly got a feeling the older female also knew Natsu's quirks quite well, considering their time together was significantly shorter since Mira stopped coming with them to missions. The two girls walked out when Natsu moved to the doors and stood back as the pink-haired teen closed the doors behind them, waiting for him to start the long walk back. The sun outside has climbed some way up the sky but not too high, it was obviously early. In the silence broken only by the sparrows in the trees, it was easy to forget their guild hall was completely demolished and that only yesterday they were in a war with another guild. Natsu moved fluidly in front of them, still silent, his head down, one hand fingering the edge of the black scales on the muffler around his neck, eyes studying the glint of the morning sun reflected in them. Why I still care about you is a mystery. Dragon Prince looked up. Care to explain, you overgrown wizard? The moon has risen some hours ago, though only a thin wisp of it was visible, signaling new moon was only a few days away. Forest of Magnolia was as usually quiet for the late hours, only crickets finding fun in breaking it. Crickets and one particular blonde who ran as fast as she could through the uneven terrain, still stumbling every few steps as her legs caught in low branches and roots that decided staying underground was too good for them. Loke, Lucy called again, panic evident in her voice as she stumbled yet again, this time losing her balance and getting a mouthful of dried leaves and dirt. She spat and quickly scrambled to her feet. Loke, where are you? Her only reply was the scattering crickets and an owl that hooted at her loud presence. The orange-haired teen didn't look good when she last saw him. He didn't look good at all, and the worry was threatening to burst her chest as her heart beat frantically. The news Crux dumped on her was nowhere near making all this easier. Lucy knew of Karen Lilica of Blue Pegasus. The woman was famous for being an accomplished celestial stellar mage and just as infamous for her treatment over them through. The woman was dead for a few years now. What relationship Loke had with her made Lucy think some rather ridiculous thoughts that in any other situation would truly be ridiculous, but now made a terrifying sense. The fact orange-haired teen cut all his ties in Magnolia along with quitting Fairy Tail was another matter to worry. She was not the only one to worry, of course, and it was proven by the distant voices of other members of Team Urza and several other members of Fairy Tail who searched for the missing ex-member. Lucy huffed in annoyance as she pushed forward. She had a pretty good idea where Loke was, and as she stumbled out into the clearing, confirming her suspicions. Loke, she called tentatively to the teen kneeling before Lone Tombstone, and she was not surprised to see him jump, but she still felt a pang of guilt at startling him. Loke whipped around and looked at her with wide eyes. His face was even paler than Lucy remembered, and the black bags under his eyes were disturbingly large. He looked like he didn't sleep for 2 weeks straight. Lucy, Loke choked out. Why are you? You can't be here. He stood up abruptly but stumbled, almost falling. Lucy rushed to aid her friend, studying him on his feet. You alright? Lucy asked and mentally kicked herself. He was obviously not alright. Why? Yes, Loke replied reluctantly as he eyed the blonde teen beside him. Why are you here? Well, I was worried about you, of course, Lucy huffed. Baka, leaving like that and making us all sick with worry. Loke blushed as he sat back down with a pant. Sorry, Loke, Lucy spoke again, this time saying the name as if testing it on her tongue, and Loke immediately stiffened. That's not your real name, is it? Loke just stayed quiet, staring at her in silent shock. Leo the lion suits you better after all, Lucy said as she sat beside him. Why aren't you in the spirit world? The lengthy explanation she received made her stomach roll in disgust at the dead mage whose tombstone she could reach by just extending her hand, and burning anger at the Spirit King for its stupidity. That wasn't your fault, she finally said when Loke fell silent. Loke, Leo, she reminded herself, was silent as he stared at her in silence once again. You don't understand, he finally tried reasoning with her, but Lucy would hear none of that. No, you're the one who doesn't understand. None of it was your fault. Karen is at fault. Karen and Celestial Spirit King. Leo gave her a look like she just stated the sky wasn't blue. His Majesty is an old prick, Lucy concluded. Leo gawked at her, almost making her uncomfortable from what she said. Almost. Leo gasped suddenly, Any trace of shock at his companion vanishing as he took hold of his head and his back arched, pain blinding him momentarily as he cried out, making Lucy jump to her feet in alarm, panic only growing when she noticed a disturbing fact that Leo's legs were getting see-through. "What's happening to you?" Lucy asked worriedly. I was banished from the celestial world after Karen died," Leo gasped in pain, clutching his head. "I've been in this world for 3 years," Lucy's eyes grew wide. 3 years? I thought that was impossible for you. For any celestial spirit, Loke gave a weak chuckle. For most, it is, but I am. Or rather was the leader of the Zodiac. I'm a tad bit more powerful than them, Lucy swallowed, not quite entertained by Leo's weak attempt at humor. What could she do? She didn't even have his key, she couldn't just. Or maybe she could. Lucy swallowed again, trying to push the bile that rose in her throat down before she grasped Loki's hand. What are you doing? Lucy, Leo asked the blonde, who gave him a weak smile. Well, I thought that would be rather obvious. I'm saving you, of course. Loke shook his head. You can't, Lucy, there is no. The spirit fell silent when he felt Lucy's magic rising, and the blonde spoke. Gate of the Lion, I close thee. Lucy, you can't. Gate of the Lion, I close thee. She ignored Loki's pleas to stop and simply spoke louder. It was painful. Lucy would never deny that, as instead of closing the gates she started merging her life force with Loki's. But she wouldn't stop now. She couldn't stop now. For crying out loud, she was so close. Stop it. Loke tried to pull his hand away from hers, but in his weakened state, the girl wouldn't budge. You'll die with me if you keep this up. Like I care, Lucy muttered as she continued to chant. It felt like her blood was on fire, but she prayed to whichever god listened that she was close. She knew she was close. The night sky suddenly flashed bright, blinding them both momentarily, and for a moment Lucy wondered whatever she died. That would be quite anticlimactic. But she couldn't be dead. Loke was still in her hands, though she couldn't quite see him due to the sudden light, but she could make out his outline and feel him there. Who dares to disobey the king? The booming voice made her back go stiff as she sat straighter and squinted at the figure that appeared in the light before it finally died down, leaving her blinking rapidly before she was finally able to face the newcomer. She would have gaped at the celestial king if she wasn't so terrified. Unjust king has no rule over me, she replied with a glare, hiding her fear rather well if she could say so herself. A dram little thing with wasp mouth, the king spoke with a frown. Lucy only glared further. She had every right to call her tiny, though, because the king could easily match Master Makarov's titan form and then some. Cease thy foolish actions, human, and let you kill my friend. Murderer. Lucy yelled at the king, who seemed surprised by her words. Surprised but mostly angry. Thou dare clep me a killer, he boomed. I hast every right to banish the lion. He hath broken the sacred bond, did violate the sacred rule. He is to die, Lucy huffed. A sacred bond is shared when the mage and spirit have their hearts in it. The bond of celestial spirits has no meaning if the mage has no heart to give. Karen died because she had no bond. Not because Loke broke it. Loke stared at the blonde mage in wonder, her words making his heart lighter. The king also fell quiet, interested in the small human before him and her bold words. Thou bethink thou what of our rules and bonds, thou wee dram thing. If you allow me to speak, my king. Lucy's head whipped to her right as Virgo bowed to the king, who, along with the two other before him, stared at the Zodiac, who appeared without anyone calling her. Princess is a wise human, her words in her heart are in place. Lucy blinked at her spirit, touched beyond words. The king also stared at Virgo in silence. Wise, haply, but I will not let the lion back to our realm, he is to die, king replied. Lucy scowled and squeezed her eyes, heart beating furiously against her chest in her anger. Why can't you just listen? She yelled at the king, her magic rising. Listen for God's forsaken moment, you big oaf. He has done nothing wrong. Loke gasped as Lucy's hands started glowing in golden light that spread over her whole body. Not even the king could surpass the gasp as one by one, Lucy's spirits started appearing behind her. Impossible, the king gasped as the spirits of his own realm stared down at him, all bonded to the girl's magic. Thy bond with the spirits is strong, stronger than any I've seen, the king spoke quietly as the girl gasped for breath, the spirits behind her disappearing, but the air remained thick with her magic. Thove did manage to impress me. Something not many hast done, the king admitted and gazed at Loke, who looked back at the king almost pleadingly. Thou art worthy of the keys thou carrieth, and of the key thou wilt carrieth, Lucy looked at the king in surprise, hope rising in her eyes. Are you saying? The king nodded as he extended his hands, a golden key that looked tiny in his giant hand appearing in golden light. For impressing me I present thou with this opportunity, keepeth the key of the lion and he wilt liveth or discard, and he wilt die. What doth thou declare? Lucy jumped to her feet and extended her hands. I will be honored to keep it. Valorous choice. The king spoke and the key fell in Lucy's hands before the king disappearing in another explosion of light that once again left the two blinded. Lucy smiled as she looked at the key of the Leo the lion in her hands before she turned to look at Loke who was gaping at her like a fish out of the water, mouth opening and closing. What? Explaining the next morning what happened was something Lucy had quite a bit of trouble doing, especially because she herself wasn't quite sure how she'd done it. Well, it's important that Loki's alright now, Urza concluded as she stabbed her fork in the strawberry cake in front of her. The cafe they sat in wasn't overly crowded considering the time for breakfast was over and the time for lunch was not yet here. It was somewhat weird, sitting in cafe after most of her meals were eaten in guild ever since she joined Fairy Tail, Lucy mused, but it was hardly surprising considering the guild hall was still in ruins. I can't wrap my head around it, though, Gray said, a tuna sandwich in his hands. Loke, the ladies' man Loke, a celestial spirit, it's hard to swallow, Happy agreed, munching on a fish. Lucy smiled as she reached into her pockets. The point is, she pulled out a stack of tickets of some sort. He doesn't have use of these tickets anymore so he gave them to me. Tickets for what? Wendy asked in interest, sipping on her hot chocolate. A 5-star hotel, Lucy said with a grin that only widened at the starry-eyed look she received from the mages around her. At a beach, Lucy held out 5 tickets for her friends to see before she turned to Happy and Carla. And I've already asked the hotel and they allowed you to without any additional cost as long as you don't eat at the hotel. Happy and Carla brightened before Carla pointed out, you have 1 ticket extra. Lucy nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. I know, I'm not sure who should I ask. Oh, wait. I do know. The other 5 stayed silent, urging her to continue. Well, Natsu of course. Wendy smiled brightly while other 4 blanched. Natsu. Gray choked out. Are you feeling okay? You maybe used too much magic last night. Wanna go see Perliuzica? Lucy glared at him with a huff. My head is screwed on just fine. I would be worried about yours though. Gray rolled his eyes but continued. But seriously, why not? Lucy shrugged. He's a friend. And he did help out a great deal during the fight with Phantom Lord. Speaking of that, have you guys seen him since then? Urza spoke up as she turned to Wendy. I haven't seen him whole morning. Wendy's mood grew somber at that as she explained with a sigh. He took Mira and me to the edge of the forest this morning and left, said he had something to do but that he'll find us later. He's been quiet whole morning, more so than usual so I'm a little worried, he's just a moody bastard. I don't see why are you so worried about him all the time, Gray shrugged. Who taught you manners must lack them themselves or are rather poor teachers. It is not nice to talk behind someone's back. Gray would have yelped if he wasn't too afraid to do so as Natsu took the emptiest seat beside him, cup of coffee in his hands and looking at the ice mage from the corner of his eyes. The table fell silent for a moment, all of the mages not sure what to say because of his sudden arrival. If you're too uncomfortable to talk with me here I'll leave. Natsu raised one eyebrow while the table stayed silent. Have you finished whatever you were doing? Wendy decided to ask as she looked at her brother who sat across from her, giving her a clear look. Natsu turned his attention to her and gave a small, lopsided smile. Natsu had little doubt his sister could smell the blood of a forest Vulcan he killed. Stress therapy not used for the first time, but since no one around the table gave him an odd look he deduced he cleaned his face well. Finished quite quickly actually, Natsu responded, the small smile barely visible disappearing. Wendy smiled at him and gave Lucy a meaningful glance the blonde quickly understood. So Natsu, Lucy smiled nervously as Natsu's black eyes turned to look at her. I've been meaning to ask you. The dragon prince raised his eyebrow at the girl who swallowed. You see I have these tickets. And I wanted to ask. I mean if you're okay with it. You know you don't have to. Anyway, would you? What? Natsu asked as he tapped his fingers on the cup still clasped in one hand. Lucy blushed, realizing her sentence made little to no sense. Would you like to go with us? She gestured to the mages and cats gathered around the table. To the hotel on the beach. Natsu stayed silent, silently surprised at the offer, but it was only visible in the way his drumming fingers froze before he started drumming on the cup again, making the blonde mage nervous. And the others are okay with that? Natsu finally asked, his eyes moving over the people around the desk. Gray opened his mouth, a sarcastic comment on his lips that he swallowed quickly as Urza's boot almost cracked his shin. The scarlet-haired mage didn't seem to move to those watching her as she calmly took another bite of her cake. Of course, she told the Slayer. As long as you want to come, you are welcome to. Natsu nodded after a moment before he turned to Lucy. Out of curiosity, I must ask, why me? Lucy looked at her green tea nervously. Well, you did save me from Phantom Lord, and if you think you owe me, you don't. I was doing my duty to the guild, Natsu replied, back straight and fingers still drumming. Lucy frowned. That's not the reason. You didn't let me finish. You saved me from Phantom Lord, and I would like to believe we're friends, so we should get to know each other better. Natsu settled to staring at her once again, making her increasingly uncomfortable. Well, the Dragon Slayer spoke when Lucy was about to ask. I don't have anything better to do, considering the guild hall and all that. Natsu spared a glance at Wendy, who nodded vigorously. I will go. Lucy beamed at him as she slammed the ticket in front of him. That's great. Yes, Wendy cheered, pumping her fist up. Hooray! Gray's sarcastic reply was answered by another kick from Urza, who smiled pleasantly, popping another bite of strawberry cheesecake in her mouth. It will be nice to spend some time away from the guild and get some quality time together, Urza said, ignoring the glare Gray sent her way as he rubbed his shin. I guesses. Natsu's monotone voice was not surprising, but his lips twitched into something that might resemble a smile. It was probably some general rule in the universe that when you're in a hurry everything goes wrong, and every street you try to run through is packed with people to the point you can barely walk. Wendy huffed in frustration as she tried to hurry through the river of people on her way to the train station. Little blue-haired girl worried she will be late for the train. Happy and Carla flew beside her, each of them carrying their own form of baggage, though in Happy's case his little bundle contained only a fresh salmon. Carla huffed in annoyance and settled on Wendy's head. We could always carry you to the station, Wendy. The white cat supplied the girl with a possible solution. Wendy nodded with a sigh. I know, but my suitcase might be too heavy and I won't be that late. Hopefully. She looked up at the roof of the train station and the clock that was now visible. And besides, we're almost there. A crowd of people suddenly rushed to the side and Wendy grumbled under her breath as a woman almost threw her to the ground. The young dragon slayer looked to the side to see what all the racket was for and quickly got her answer in a form of a small mountain of, well, everything that informed the girl Urza was also coming. I should have gone with her, Wendy said as she pushed her way toward the Scarlet Mage, who marched towards the station, unbothered by the people around her. Happy and Carla nodded in agreement as they got closer, realizing Gray and Lucy were with Titania as well. Hey Wendy, Lucy greeted the first since she was the first to see her. Good to see you've made it. Well, it was not easy, Wendy said with a small chuckle. Have you seen Natsu? He's probably already on the station, Gray mused. He can pop right where he wants in a second after all. True, Wendy agreed as the group of 6 entered the station, and sure enough, the pinkhead was watching them, arms crossed and back rigid like always. Late as always, Natsu spoke when they got close enough. An old and worn backpack that was probably at one point black but now settled for gray strapped over one shoulder, covered by the black cloak he wore all those weeks ago in Hergen, the hood covering his head. Not that late, Gray argued, glancing at the clock above Pinkhead. Just 20 minutes. We didn't miss our train, did we? No, Natsu replied flatly. The crowd's pretty big today, Lucy reasoned. It probably didn't bother you too much if you used Chaotic Void. I do walk, you know. The Dragon Slayer looked at the blonde. I'm not using that spell to get everywhere, Lucy blushed but didn't reply. We're late and there's nothing to do about it now other than board the train, Urza proclaimed, grip on her small wagon tightening as she started pulling it towards their train that gave a whistle, obviously ready to depart in a few minutes. Cursed vehicle, Natsu muttered, his own grip on the backpack he carried tightening. You said something, Lucy blinked up at him. Natsu gave her some sort of half shrug with one shoulder. Not a thing. Natsu watched as Team Urza took their seats in the empty compartment they found in the train, and the pinkhead found himself standing in the entrance of the compartment, awkwardly unsure if he should take the empty seat beside Urza or continue walking and find another compartment to sit in. His quiet dilemma was answered by Urza, who gave him a strange look and voiced her thoughts. Why are you standing there? Come on in already and close the door. Natsu blinked and stepped inside, sitting beside scarlet-haired wizard. You need to relax a bit, Lucy laughed good-naturedly, watching as Natsu sat in his seat looking like he swallowed an eel. We are going on a vacation, not a mission. Natsu turned to look at her as he lowered his hood and set the backpack on his lap but didn't move to make himself any more comfortable. I am relaxed, the pinkhead informed the blonde, who gave him a skeptical look that clearly said, oh, really? As relaxed as I can be, he supplied, and the wheels of the train squealed and started rolling, another whistle warning people outside the train was moving. Lucy gave him a sympathetic face when his face turned green, though she quickly hid her own at the glare he gave her before he gasped and took hold of his stomach, resting his forehead on the cool glass beside him. It's really bad, that motion sickness of yours, isn't it? Urza asked the dragon slayer, who managed to send her a dry look. What gave it away? Green face, Gray said matter-of-factly, a not-so-manly yelp escaping his lips when Lucy's elbow buried in his ribs. They were surprised, however, to see Natsu's lips twitch up for a second before he stood up and rushed to the window, his stomach unable to take the movement anymore, and the dragon slayer threw up what was most likely his breakfast. Happy scrunched his nose in disgust and looked at the fish in his paws before putting the half-eaten meal back in its bundle. Carla smirked at him at the blue feline rolled his eyes as Natsu took back his seat, not looking or feeling any better. The train ride lasted 3 horrible hours, which the group talked, or in Natsu's case listened, trying to hold his stomach in place. A torture the pink head swore he will never endure as beads of sweat rolled down his back. When the train stopped on their destination, Team Urza was left wondering whatever the dragon slayer disappeared using chaotic void, or he ran out of the train at that speed. Never again, Natsu proclaimed when they found him standing outside, his naturally pale skin without the green tint to it anymore. You say that every time, Wendy reminded the dragon slayer with a grin. Natsu shrugged. And I avoid the train to the best of my abilities, but I couldn't just use the spell to get here. I was never here before and you would miss my charming company. Despite the blank face and toneless voice, the group was left gawking while the dragon slayer started walking down the road. He just made a joke, Gray pointed a shaky finger as he whispered shouted. The end of the world looms over yous, Happy nodded his head sagely. The hotel obviously deserved its 5 stars. The marble floors and stone columns along with red velvety carpet and soft elegant sofas in the corner were a sight to behold, and the giant crystal chandelier in the middle was only another reason to stop and gawk at the entrance. Shiny, Natsu remarked, face as blank as always. He was not one to like all the unnecessary kitsch, and this was certainly over the top. Seriously, even Palace of Dova was not this shiny. He couldn't think of a better world. Reception at the end of the entrance was just as decorated and classy, and people inside all dressed in expensive suits and dresses left the group somewhat self-conscious. Most of the group, anyway. Natsu couldn't care less. Though it was amusing to see Gray go red when Lucy pointed out he missed his shirt again, probably left it on his way to the hotel. How many rooms do we have, anyway? Gray peered over Lucy's shoulder as the blonde greeted the female receptionist with a smile and handed their tickets. 2, Lucy answered. 1 with 2 separate beds and 1 with king-size bed. That sounds a bed too short. Happy flown up on the counter, making the poor receptionist yelp in surprise at the talking and flying cat. Wendy, Urza and I will share the king-sized bed. It should be enough because judging by the size of this place, king-size bed will be fit for 3 kings, Lucy gave a laugh. Wait. Does that mean? Gray glanced at Natsu in bewilderment. You'll be sharing the room with Natsu, Urza confirmed. Gray looked at Natsu in utter horror while Natsu simply shrugged and replied to his look. Don't look at me like that. It's not like I'll drink your blood while you sleep. You're in good mood, Wendy noticed, her eyes on her big brother and arms crossed. Natsu didn't move to reply, but his silence was an answer on its own. Here are our keys. Lucy held the keys in her hand proudly. Room 203-4 and 227-4 inches. It's good that we're on the same floor. Urza mused, and the group moved to the elevators, excited to leave their stuff in the room and race to the beach. Natsu walked next to Gray after girls entered their room, an agreement to meet at the entrance of the hotel achieved before they parted. Gray gave nervous look to the dragon slayer, who rejected the old backpack on his shoulder. Gray swallowed when Natsu's eyes turned to him, though some confidence returned after Natsu raised his eyebrow at him in the typical manner he used to show he was listening. Have you ever been to a hotel like this? You mean fancy or on the beach? Natsu questioned after a moment, entertained by the conversation for the time being. Either, I guess. But I meant fancy, Gray replied, genuinely surprised the Dragon Slayer was willing to hold a conversation with him. I've slept in a cave near a beach for few weeks during my time with father, and I've seen plenty of places even more decorated than this place, but I can't say I was in a hotel such as this before, Gray hummed in agreement. Me neither. Your lack of clothing certainly supports that claim. Natsu looked at the raven-haired mage who rolled his eyes at the pinkhead. I lost my shirt somewhere on the way here. I'll probably go look for it later. Do you always find the clothes you lose? No, Gray admitted sheepishly. More often not than yes actually. Natsu almost sounded amused by this point. So your biggest investment is in buying new clothing? More or less is. Gray shrugged, stopping as the two faced the doors of their room and pulled the key he took from Lucy out of the pocket on his pants. The room was, just like the rest of the place, little over the top with all gold and crystal, and both boys readily agreed on it though neither voiced it. That being said, the bed was incredibly comfortable, as Gray deduced in the first minute they entered as he threw himself and his stuff on one of the beds. You don't mind sleeping next to the window? Gray lifted his head to look at the Dragon Prince, who shook his head, sitting on the bed instead of throwing himself on it like his temporary roommate did. Gray backpack put on the nightstand next to his head. No, Natsu said as he looked at the view he got from his window. The beach was visible from the height they were on, and while the view was quite nice, the window also faced east. Seriously, who does that and doesn't even place some heavy curtains? The beach was packed with people even though it was well past 5 by the time the 6 made it to the beach. The almost unbearably hot sun that still seared down on them probably had something to do with it. Urza stretched her arms as she set her things on the white sand. A black bikini that covered her stretched against her as the men around her looked up, whispering soon once they saw the fairy tale insignia. I haven't been to a beach for years. Urza dropped her arms with a happy sigh and turned to Lucy, who set down her noticeably bigger beach bag and blue towel, pink two-piece hugging her figure. I was at Harjan with Natsu relatively recently, though we didn't really stop to take a swim. Wendy smiled as she sat down on the sand, Carla and Happy walking beside her. Harjan is primary a port, so they don't really have a beach to use, Natsu informed his sister as he walked to her side, dark blue sleeveless shirt and black trousers on him with his black muffler tied around his head. Lucy eyed the pinkhead subtly, since he was probably wearing the least clothes she's seen him wear so far. Gray was unsurprisingly missing anything but his light blue swimming trunks, and the mage either didn't bother to carry a towel or lost it on his way to the beach. It's a shame we arrived here so late. It was obviously a pretty good day to be on the beach. You could have listened to me when I said we should take the earlier train, Natsu spoke matter-of-factly. And depart at 6:30? Gray asked with raised eyebrow. No, thank you. A sly grin spread over raven-haired ice mage, who turned to the sea and started running. Last in the water buys dinner. Lucy and Wendy jumped to their feet with a startled look and raced in the water, Carla and Happy laughing as they spread their wings and flew to the water. Urza and Natsu stood rotted to their spot, the former blinking owlishly while the latter merely raised an eyebrow, the childish behavior of his guildmates befuddling him. Gray looked at them in betrayal, lower lips protruding in a pout and a glare on his face. Wendy crossed her arms, her feet ankle-deep in the water. Come on, you two. Or do you want to split the bill? Ah, I don't mind paying, Natsu replied with some hesitation, one hand scratching the black bandages warped tightly around his scaled arms leadingly. Wendy mock glared at him. She knew quite well that those bandages won't come loose if he entered the water, so he better get his ass moving. Natsu, she called him with a serious face, trying hard not to laugh at the incredulous look Lucy and Gray sent her way. When Natsu didn't move, a sly look crossed her young face and the girl whipped her arms around, wine picking up beside her. Natsu kept a straight face even though he knew what followed, and by the time the wave 3 meters high splashed over him and drenched him completely, his face was as impassive as ever, but his eye twitched. The people around them didn't sound quite pleased about getting wet either, but that was a moot point because Urza also ended wet, and you don't get Urza wet and go unpunished. A glare that even Natsu was impressed with set in Urza's eyes as she rushed into the water, a sword appearing in her hands, and Wendy gave a yelp and started running towards the open sea, once deep enough to swim using magic to propel herself further in the water. Natsu appeared beside Urza in knee-length water and spoke. I'll hold her, you attack. Urza gave him a side glance before she smirked and nodded, Natsu disappearing beneath the water as the void opened beneath him. Lucy and Gray exchanged a nervous look. A pact between two devils was formed and it did not bode well for anyone. It took Natsu only a second to reach the blue-haired girl and drag her laughing and screaming to the waiting Urza, who threw herself on the task of tickling her mercilessly. Wendy screamed through tears of mirth as the scarlet-haired mage moved to her bare feet, but her brother held her in place. It took almost a full minute before the two dropped the laughing girl, who fell in the water, gasping for breath and still laughing. "You're awful," she exclaimed once she was capable of speaking. Urza just sent her a smirk while Natsu shook his head, some water spraying around from his drenched hair and clothes. The shirt he still had on him was glued to his skin, so with a sigh he pulled it over his head and twisted the fabric, the water dripping out. "Seriously, Wendy," Wendy stopped laughing, her eyes fixed on the new set of bandages wrapped around his stomach that she hasn't seen until now. The others also had their eyes fixed on Natsu, but the reason was not the sudden addition to the bandages but the jagged and scarred skin that decorated his chest. No one really commented on it, and the only recognition it got was a small gasp from Lucy before the blonde could stop herself. As soon as he looked up, the others averted their eyes and the group fell silent. "Water fight," Happy decided, unable to take the silence, and splashed as much as he could at Lucy, who glared at him and reached for his tail, but the cat moved out of her range. Happy moved backward until he slammed into Gray, who pulled him under the water for a brief moment, laughing when Happy exited with a scowl. "That was not fair. You said water fight," Gray replied with a sly grin as he formed his ice cannon with an incantation and a slam of his fists, the cannon sending a jet of water at Urza, who moved out of the way and splashed as much as she could in Wendy's direction. Wendy grinned and slammed her fists into the water, her magic allowing her to make the biggest splash, this time drenching everyone along with herself. She spat out a mouthful of salty water and grinned sheepishly while the other five glared at her. "You're so on," Lucy laughed before she and Gray turned towards her as one, and Wendy laughed again. "Hey. No team up, I say there is." A cold hand grasped her shoulder and Wendy looked up to see Natsu's blank face, a small but barely visible smirk playing on his lips. The brunette grinned and turned to suddenly pale Lucy and Gray. "No team up," Lucy squeaked as the two dragon slayers moved towards them. "Dragon slayers versus Team Urza." Urza seemed amused at that. "Very well." The people at the beach were left staring and gawking as the shore became a battle zone, ice walls rising and black tornadoes swirling. By the time the group calmed down, the beach was empty and the moon was high, sun long disappearing behind the horizon. It was a surprisingly pleasant day, Urza mused as she looked at the wizards gathered around her. The rest chatted happily among themselves while Natsu and herself stood beside but didn't speak, each for the reason of their own. Urza remained quiet because she wanted to observe for a moment while Natsu was being Natsu. Though he was surprisingly friendly today, she could have sworn she saw him smirk at one point, a smirk larger than the usual twitch and unlike usually lacking the sinister twinge. She found herself liking him more and comfortable in his presence for the first time in years. "Where to now?" Gray asked the group once the towels were gathered. "I saw they have a casino, so we could check it out." "I've never been to one," Lucy proposed. Wendy looked at her, a confused frown on her face. "They let people under 18 in." Lucy looked at the girl and smiled brightly. "They do, but you won't be allowed to gamble." Wendy blinked, pleasantly surprised, and smiled happily. "I'm in then." "Me too," Gray agreed. Urza nodded confidently. "Count me in. I was never of lucky hand in gamble, but I'm always ready to give it a try." The group looked at Silent Pinkhead pointedly. Natsu shrugged. "If everyone is going, I'll go as well." Lucy grinned. "Great." Wendy sat on the giant bed, dressed in one of the few fancy dresses she possessed. Emerald green kippah dress reached her knees and black curves designed the bottom of it. Black sandals decorated her feet and her hair was tied in a bun at the top of her head. She was watching the other two girls, still running around the bathroom and getting ready for their late-night trip. Carla huffed beside her, clearly annoyed at Happy's whining, who was bored out of his mind. "Are they ready yet?" Happy asked with a heavy sigh. "By the looks of it. No," Wendy sighed. Spending so much time with Natsu certainly had quite a few advantages, and getting ready in a minimal amount of time was one of them, since Natsu didn't tolerate tardiness. And being late, let's not forget being late. "Should we go see if Gray and Natsu are ready?" Carla looked at Wendy, who shrugged. They could, but the blue-haired girl didn't really see the use of that other than make the time go faster, but certainly not by much. "No need for that," Urza called. "We're ready to go." Urza stepped out of the bathroom. Black Empire dress hugged her body with heels that matched her hair on her feet. Lucy a step behind her, a long red bell-shaped dress that at the front went above her knees and behind fell down to her ankles, showing the white, dangerously high heels on her feet. "Let's win us some money," Lucy cheered. "I need to pay my rent and there is no reason to not get enough money for it on a vacation. Be careful or you'll lose more than you get," Happy told her with a cheesy grin. Lucy rolled her eyes. "I don't like to brag, but I have a pretty good relationship with Lady Luck." The knock on their door stopped their talk, and after Urza called whoever was at the door in, pink-haired teen opened them, revealing Gray and himself fully dressed, and Wendy had to raise an eyebrow in wonder. This was probably the first time she saw Natsu in the suit. The high-quality fabric was black and looked like the suit itself was made by his measures, and considering the amount of money she knew he had, it probably was. The black jacket he wore over the rest of the fancy clothing was even ironed. Gray waistcoat-covered dark red shirt and black necktie was masterfully tied around his neck, and his black muffler was dropped over his shoulders. Gray was in a suit of his own, but it only consisted of light blue shirt under the dark blue jacket. Gambling is not all about luck. Counting cards is also a very good way of getting some money. Natsu spoke to the silent room, looking pointedly at Lucy, who blushed slightly realizing he heard her last comment. "You gamble?" Urza looked at the Dragon Slayer in slight surprise, unable to imagine the stoic pinkhead over the green table playing poker. Though his blank face would probably drive the people he played with crazy. Natsu nodded, almost reluctantly, when attention turned to him. On some of the more quiet jobs that required getting to talk with high-class people. Whales can give you some very interesting information if you know how to ask. Whales? Gray asked in askance. What on earth are whales? I doubt he's talking about animals. A high roller, a player who wagers massive amounts of money. Everyone turned to Wendy, who blushed and ducked her head in her shoulders. What? I know some things too. With that said, the conversation carried on as the group made their way to the basement where the casino was, filled with people dressed in formal clothing and pretty waitresses carrying large trays with tall champagne glasses and the sparkling liquid inside. The room was massive and just like the rest of hotel, dressed in gold, velvet, and silk. Makes you wonder, how did Lope get enough money to get tickets for a full week in this place? They must have cost a fortune, Gray snickered. No kidding. Lucy smiled. We'll really have to make it up to him. Let's check it out. Gray was eager to start and the group split. Wendy and Kat stayed on the side, knowing full well that they shouldn't venture too deep. Urza sat at one of the tables for blackjack just as the girl started dealing cards to the several already gathered players. A man in a suit with his fingers covered in golden rings looked at her over the rim of his sunglasses as Urza sat down and smirked but did not speak. 100 yules, Urza said as she pushed the paper money to the girl, who smiled pleasantly and handed the scarlet-haired beauty the chip. Careful, the man beside her snarked. That's a lot of money, he mocked. I like to play careful when it comes to the games mostly based on luck, Urza said pleasantly, one eye on the man beside her, the other on the cards the girl put before her. I already told you that gambling is not all about luck. Urza jumped at the familiar voice of the Dragon Slayer as Natsu took the empty seat on her other side. 200 inches, he told the girl and gave her the money. You'll play? Urza sounded surprised. Natsu shrugged his usual one-shoulder shrug. I'm in the casino and there are some familiar faces I haven't seen in a while, right Walter? Urza rose her eyebrow in confusion as the man beside her tensed, looking at the newcomer carefully for the first time since he sat. Soul Eater. Walter tapped his ringed fingers on the table nervously before he gathered his chips and walked away hurriedly, leaving the rest of the players eyeing the teen worriedly. Natsu ignored them masterfully and signaled the girl to give him another card. You old enough to be here, kid? Wrinkled old man, tall and thin, took Walter's place. Wizards are allowed in the casino when they turn 16 inches, Natsu spoke and took the chips he won. You're a wizard? The girl who was dealing the cards spoke for the first time. You registered? Natsu nodded. Both of us had. He gestured to the still confused Urza. Registered where? She whispered to him after a moment. Natsu raised an eyebrow at her. You have to register at the entry if you're a wizard. The security will keep better eye on you to keep you from using magic to win. Urza gave a chuckle and split her hand. To how many casinos were you since you turned 16? Natsu actually seemed to think about it. Not much. Not many jobs related to it make it to the S-class rank, so I don't bother doing them, but I've been on. Maybe 4 or so. I've never seen them on mission board, Urza commented. Natsu's lip twitched up for a second. With a reason. Master keeps them with him and gives them only to me because the last time Gildarts took it he blew half of casino up in the air and lost more money than the bills he made for Makarov. That being said, Myris not all that good and Laxus couldn't put on a poker face in a card game if his life depended on it, and me. You seem to rely too much on luck by the looks of it, Natsu commented, and Urza turned another card, smiling as she took several chips she had won. Good luck, but luck Nonathelis, Natsu continued. True, Urza laughed. What kind of jobs take you to casino anyway? Natsu gave her a side glance and took the newly won chips. That would be unprofessional of me if I went around telling people of all the things I did. Urza nodded in understanding and took another card. Why do you always wear black? Lucy wondered and eyed the pinkhead, the small mountain of chips on his side of the table making her wonder how much money he already won and more than a little bit jealous. Black is my lucky color, Natsu replied and looked at his cards. Poker was not the game he played often, sticking to blackjack, but if he had counted correctly, and he always did, he had pretty good odds. The woman beside him grinned and put down her hand, showing the cards and making most of the players groan. Straight flush, the woman grinned, twirling one finger around golden necklace on her neck. The queen high straight flush in hearts was not something you see often. Natsu looked at his hand as other players put theirs down. Not often but not unheard of. Natsu put down his hand, royal flush, the woman's grin disappeared in an instant, jaw falling open as the best possible combination stared back at her. That's not possible, she shrieked after she got over her initial shock. Lucy looked just as shocked as everyone else around the table. Of course, it is, Natsu responded mildly. The odds are 1 in 649,739, but it is possible. The man who was dealing the cards stared stupidly in front of himself. He worked in this casino for almost 10 years and this was the first time a straight flush hadn't won the game. Wendy watched with wry amusement as Natsu walked to her and sat down on the sofa she, Happy and Carla have been occupying for the last several hours. She saw security walk to him while he played on one of the tables closer to her, and while she was worried at first, the worry quickly disappeared when he simply rose and nodded his head politely. What was that about? Carla asked curiously. Natsu looked at her and almost looked amused for a second. They are not happy when people can count the cards. Apparently having good memory in any casino is forbidden, any casino. Happy snickered. This happened to you before? In every casino I've been so far, Natsu said with a shake of his head. I wouldn't be surprised if they banned me from entering any casino in Fury soon. That bad? Wendy asked dryly, though clearly amused. Horrible. Natsu spoke completely serious, though the good mood from the morning obviously still made him capable to make some light jokes. How much did you won? Happy asked, his eyes moving to the briefcase now in Pinkhead's possession. 500,000 yules, Natsu said with a twitch of his lips before he stood up. Now if you could keep an eye on it for me. I need to go and relieve myself. Wendy smiled and nodded, taking the briefcase from him and putting it in her lap, her eyes on Natsu as he walked to the doors on the other side of the room. He never made it to the doors when the sound of a gunfire reached her ears and her eyes widened in horror as what was clearly a bullet went in Natsu's head, blood spraying the expensive carpet, and the wizard collapsed bonelessly to the floor. Wendy's eyes widened in horror as she screamed. The room was quickly thrown into chaos and the sudden blackout that followed was almost certain to cause a stampede. In the darkness of the room, filled with panicked screams and footsteps, Wendy squeezed her eyes shut, sure she would soon be run over by a mob of people because the exit was practically right behind her. The stampede never came and the lights blinked back to life, leaving Wendy completely flabbergasted. All of the people that used to fill the space were gone, vanished. The sudden silence was deafening and her heart beating in her throat didn't help as her eyes frantically searched for Natsu's fallen form. Her heart must have skipped a bit when she found him still lying in the same position, still and unmoving while the rest of the team stood around. No one noticed him from the looks of it since she was the only one with a clear look at him. She would have moved, ran, threw herself at him, but she found herself unable to move. Pink rope warped around her and Lucy, who had her eyes wide in shock. Happy and Carla were tied beside her, both looking thoughtfully terrified as Happy struggled against the rope only to find it tightening. Gray lied on the floor not too far from the blonde end. Was that Juvia on him? What is she doing here? Wendy searched for Urza, who was standing in front of a small group of people. The scarlet-haired mage had her back turned to the brunette so she couldn't see her face, but her back were tense and her fist clenched until knuckles turned white. This was not good. And why is Natsu still lying down? That bullet didn't really hit him, did it? He'll stand up any second now. What are you doing here? Urza choked out to the people in front of her, and by the tone of her voice Wendy knew she knew them. She also knew Urza was close to tears. Definitely not good. Sorry sisses, the blonde man cackled. But we're not here for you, though we wouldn't mind talking with you later. Here for me. Show, Urza repeated incredulously. What do you mean? You're here for someone? The blonde named Sho shrugged, a card between his fingers and littered around the floor. Wendy blinked as she looked down at the cards that cowered the floor. At first, she thought it was thrown by the people that started panicking, but now she gave a horrified gasp when she realized the picture of a woman in the card was moving, banging the fists against an invisible wall that held her in the card. Wendy looked around worriedly. There were several thousand cards on the floor, both real and magically made. Hey Urza, the woman holding them tied in the pink rope said jovially. Long time no see, Miliana. Urza almost sounded regretful. What are you doing here? She repeated after a moment. We're here for a guy who goes by the name Kira. A man whose build was entirely too cubical to be normal replied and looked around. Though I can't say I see him, he said he had pink hair, right? Miliana wondered, unconsciously tightening the rope around Lucy and Wendy, the girls who groaned under increased pressure, feeling like their arms would pop right out of their socket. The man who stayed silent until now, larger and taller than the rest, decided to speak. Pink hair and lean built, always stoic, at least that's what he said. Pink hair? Cubicle man asked abruptly and looked at the taller dark-haired one, suddenly looking nervous. Wasn't it red, salmon? Actually, Urza spoke and glared at the gathered people. You still didn't answer me. I thought you were dead and now you come here out of the blue looking for my friend and doing this. Urza gestured to the cards on the floor. Simon, what happened? The tallest tensed and looked at Urza. Things have changed. I'm sorry Urza. No, don't apologize. Tell me what is going on. We can't do that, sisses, Sho said, shaking his head, the earring on his left ear jiggling. He wouldn't be happy and don't think he wouldn't know. He knows. Who knows what? Urza was getting increasingly frustrated. Make some sense while you talk. We're here for Kira and that's all that matters, Simon told Titania, who only fumed. Light sparking her hand and sword materializing. Now about Kira, Cubic Man spoke reluctantly. Simon turned to him, eyebrow raised. Wally, what did you do? You sure he has pink hair? Duh, Miliana rolled her eyes. I think I kinda, slightly, shot him, Wally said with a nervous shrug, rolling his shoulders. Simon stared at him for a moment before he slammed his hand over his eyes. You're an idiot, bro, Sho said dryly. Wendy bit her lips and looked back at Natsu, unsure whatever she should cry out in relief when she saw his body missing. That meant he was okay, right? Urza's face went from red to white and the rest of Team Urza followed, Gray speaking after a moment. You killed our friend. He sounded like he didn't believe it. Didn't want to believe it, and Wendy couldn't blame them. They did not see Natsu hit the ground and she had, but she still didn't believe it. And judging by his missing form, she had a good reason. Not quite. He did try though. All of their heads snapped there right where Natsu sat on one of the many slot machines that filled the row. Wally's jaw fell open as he looked at Natsu like he was looking at a dead man walking. Natsu's next sentence made them realize shooting someone in the mouth is some serious bad mannerism. It was above bizarre to see him spit out a bloody bullet out. You would have had better luck if you aimed for the eyes, Natsu continued in the same nonchalant tone. You can't shot a dragon slayer in the mouth. How do you think a roar passes through and leaves me alive? I still think I would have died from something like that, Wendy muttered, and Carla had to agree. Any normal person would. Happy whispered back. Natsu stood up in a fluid motion, making the offending party tense. Now, if you wouldn't mind and stand still while I pull the guts of your friend through his mouth. He motioned to Wally, who blanched, swallowing hard as Natsu's eyes slitted. Natsu. Urza gave a weak attempt to stop him, doubting it would do much good. You can't just kill him. He was my friend. Wally glanced at Urza, his eye hidden by the oval sunglasses he wore, but he almost seemed hurt. Natsu spared her a glance before rolling his shoulders and hopping down on the floor from the slot machine he stood on and quickly moving toward the cubic man. The suit was still perfectly positioned on him, though not without a wrinkle. Simon, Miliana said meekly. We should get going. Simon looked at the shorter brown-haired girl and shook his head. It is our job to bring Kira to him. I will not fail him. Urza missed the glance Simon sent her way but Natsu didn't. You should listen to your lady friend, Natsu said conversationally, and fairy tale mages tensed. They knew that tone and the fact his back was not tense and his posture relaxed made every bell in their head screaming in alarm. Kira is not my only moniker. He was gone in a blink, appearing behind Wally and twisting his arm out of its socket in one movement. The cubic man collapsed to his knees with a gasp, one arm holding the other that dangled limply at his side. He didn't stay on his knees long as Natsu pushed his expensive and polished shoe in his back with the force that made Wally bounce off the floor before the Dragon Slayer shifted and stepped on him. Wally gasped, trying to catch the breath as the foot on him pushed his upper back, leaving his lungs empty. Get off of him, you git, Sho said, cards flashing in his hands as he threw them at the Dragon Slayer, precision and speed indicating those were no regular cards. Natsu extended his hand and the cards bursted in black energy, ashes falling slowly to the ground a few moments later. Insults, really? How old are you? 3. He's toying with yous, Simon whispered, biting his lip. He knew it before the man even moved. He warned them this would happen. But Simon was sure that between the four of them they would not have much trouble containing the pink-haired menace. They didn't have too much trouble with others and he took it as a good sign. Too soon, obviously. You thought I was serious. Natsu actually managed to make his voice sound genuine despite the dead look he gave the man whose jaw was clasped in iron. I hoped you were, Simon admitted after a moment. Sho turned to glare at his fellow wizard. We're giving up. Bro, that's not cool, we are not giving up. Simon stared Sho down, his eyes turning to Urza briefly and Natsu's eyes narrow. We are just making some adjustment to the plan. Simon made sure to catch the eyes of his teammates and nodded. In a show of great teamwork, the three mages that were not pinned down, Wally was still underneath Natsu's foot, feeling his ribs crack even more as Natsu shifted his weight, leapt up. Miliana released Lucy, Wendy, and Katz and slammed the pink rope at Natsu, who caught it and pulled, removing the woman from her feet. But even as she slammed on the floor before him, the grin on her face told her the second of distraction was enough. His eyes moved to his front when Simon held Urza down for a precious moment before Sho slammed one of his card in her back and the scarlet-haired mage disappeared. That was a wrong thing to do, Natsu hissed and Simon's eyes widened. It was time to go. Darl moment. He practically screamed when Natsu moved towards him, looking as frightening as a demon straight from the underworld. The darkness warped the room once again as Simon fingered the teleportation lacrima in his pocket. Trying to hide in the dark from a demon, a slithery, double-layered voice whispered right in his ear made his skin crawl, and he knew perfectly well the hand that sneaked around his throat would have snapped it if the lacrima didn't activate and his body became untouchable by the monster behind him. The light returned to the room as soon as Simon was gone, and it was clear the rest of his gang was gone. Natsu stood motionless in one place, hand still extended where Simon's neck used to be before he clenched it, almost cursing as he lowered it. They took her, Wendy whispered, staring where Urza's scent lingered, but the scarlet-haired mage was nowhere in sight. Natsu scowled fiercely at the floor. That they did? Shit, Gray cursed. We have to save her. Juvia agrees. Juvia added determinedly, drawing attention to herself. I know this is not a pressing matter, but why are you here? Happy peered at blue-haired woman curiously. Juvia gave a shy smile, her eyes moving to Gray behind her long lashes. Ah. Juvia was just passing by. Yay, right, Lucy scoffed before she spoke. Right, you're willing to help us. Juvia nodded again, her eyes locking with Lucis. Juvia wants to help. That's the least Juvia can do. The group of fairy tale mages gave her a long look, but the woman wouldn't budge. Whoever's willing to help is a friend in my book, Carla finally said, folding her arms and giving the ex-Phantom Lord Mage a tentative smile. That's all nice and dandy, but how are we going to find her? Gray couldn't help but ask the obvious, making the large part of the room stop in thought. They used teleportation lacrima. They knew the group had dragon slayers and they made her ability to track virtually useless. The silence that started dragging on in the room was surprisingly broken by Natsu. Ahem, he gave a fake cough to draw their attention. When all of them looked at him, he started. The teleportation lacrima is not traceable by scent to the dragon slayers, but in the tunnels of chaotic void I might be able to find her. The room knew well what that meant, and it was all Gray could do not to lose his lunch and dinner. What should we do? Lucy asked for instruction and Natsu turned to her, the situation reminding him of several recent things that happened to him. Not many people asked for his advice, and in the relatively short amount of time, several already did. He didn't wait to answer even as he dwelled on it further. Go to your rooms and change to something you can fight in. Hurry. The group nodded and Natsu disappeared through the void, probably going to his own room to change from the expansive suit. Gray started jogging to the elevator, girls soon behind her, Lucy and Wendy leading Juvia with them to their room. The speed at which Lucy took off her dress and heels was something she probably never could repeat, and she almost crashed to the floor as she tried to pull the boots on her feet in standing position. Wendy pulled down her own dress with similar success, throwing a green dress in her black sandals before drawing black fingerless gloves on her hands, metal decorating the knuckles. Juvia stood beside, making sure to stay out of the way while Lucy pulled on her own clothes, black skirt, and blue shirt on her in less than a minute. The makeup left on their faces was smeared, but the girls didn't care in the slightest. Are you ready? Wendy called to Lucy just as the blonde attached the whip and keys to her belt. Yeses. Lucy nodded, her face serious. Let's get out of here and meet with the boys. Natsu's eyes searched carefully as he walked down the long corridor, doors of all shapes and sizes lined the wall. It was rather dangerous to move through the tunnels without knowing where to go. He could stay here or between dimensions until the end of time if he chose the wrong doors, and he had no idea which he should open. Pink-haired teen glanced back at the group following him. Blank eyes stared back, neither of them aware where they were. He had one shot and he was not condemning them to a black hole. Natsu looked at the wall lined with doors and frowned, passing by the dog-shaped doors and standing in front of black metal ones. He could feel the brief magic lingering from a lacrima, hopefully, the one he was looking for. Teleportation lacrima was a nice piece of work. Whoever made it used the pocket dimensions of chaotic void, knowing that no one would be able to track it that way. Well, almost no one, a dragon slayer with knowledge of the spell might. Natsu twisted his fingers, hearing a satisfying pop before he warped his hand around the round knob of the doors. He frowned slightly. This was the first time he tried going to a place he never saw before. He knew he hadn't been through these because he would recognize them. Well, what's the worst that can happen? Natsu mused, his fingers gripping the knob tighter. He wouldn't have a problem opening them if he was alone, but getting Wendy in a private hell of any space-time traveler, because that was essentially what they were, was not a comforting thought. His eyes glanced at the group and he let a smirk pass his lips. They won't know they saw it after all. Well, he had to admit that despite his indifference to the rest of fairy tale wizards behind him, he wouldn't want them to get stuck between dimensions because of him. Natsu scrunched his nose and almost gagged. Gray, Lucy, and Urza called him their friend one too many times. Great, he was starting to care if they died a horrible death. Shaking his head, Natsu turned to the doors before him and twisted the knob. The familiar ripping sound of displaced air as he opened the doors filled his ears, and he looked at the sight before him. Wendy collapsed on the wet sand with a groan, only barely aware of Lucy's elbow in her stomach as the taller blonde fell on top of her. Gray was bent over on his hands and knees, throwing up, unable to swallow the bile that rose in his throat. Juvia was in similar state, and it was a rather weird sight to see her lower body melt into a puddle. Happy and Carla lied on the ground as well, Happy's head somehow ending underneath the sand. Natsu sighed and grabbed Happy's tail before pulling the cat out of the sand. Leaving him to suffocate seemed a bit cruel. If he wanted the cat dead, he will do it himself. Happy gagged, spitting a mouthful of sand before turning from blue to green and then red as the blood rushed to his head as Natsu continued to hold him upside down. Natsu gave a weak snicker, barely audible. Now that was some speedy color change. The cat went green again before throwing up. Let go of me, he pleaded weakly, and Natsu promptly let go of his tail, the cat once again landing on his face, but this time capable of turning around. Natsu looked at the rest to see Gray giving him incredulous look, obviously capable of gathering his thoughts enough to hear him. Well, laugh would be stretching the truth. Natsu's face fell and he quickly pulled the blank look on it. He was capable of laughing, if the rasp snicker could be called that, despite what everyone else seemed to believe. He just didn't do it in the company. You, asshole, Gray finally gasped with a weak laugh as he pushed himself to a sitting position. That was unnecessary, Natsu replied and folded his arms over his chest. And I have to admit I don't see the reason. You know it very well, Gray grinned. Natsu raised his eyebrow at him. You feeling better? Worried about little ol' me? No, just curious, Natsu said mildly. I could dump you through another void if you want. Gray paled and shook his head quickly. I'm shocked, Natsu dryly commented while Wendy sat up. Where are we? She asked, looking around. It didn't take her long to realize they were on a beach. Natsu looked around even though he had already scanned the area. The beach was covered in dark sand. Well, everything looked dark at this hour, but the sand was far from white. The sand at the beach they visited today was. It was drenched in the salty water of the sea that splashed around their feet, but not close enough to get them wet. The tide has obviously passed relatively recently. They were on an island by the looks of it, a tiny island at that. The shore was not the most interesting feature of the island, however. Tower, taller than Magnolia's cathedral, maybe even than King's Castle, towered above them, casting the already dark beach in even darker shadow. The building, that thing had probably lasted for years if not decades. The amount of details was almost frightening. The metal of which the tower was made was twisted and bent in 100 places, making the tower look almost like it had grown from the sandy ground it was built on. It almost looked alive. Heavy magic rolled down the sides of it, only reinforcing that thought. I'm not sure, Natsu answered finally, eyes moving away from the tower to look at Wendy, who had her eyes fixed on the bottom of the towers where broken spears, arrows, and swords decorated the ground mixed with skeletons. Are you sure Urs is here? Gray asked skeptically, scrunching his nose in obvious disgust. Natsu sniffed the air, ignoring as his head gave a painful jolt. His body was warning him he was using too much magic and he barely used any. She's here, Wendy nodded as well. She is. I can smell her as well. That's good, but how are we going to get inside? Lucy asked worriedly, eyeing the field of the dead that could easily be called graveyard by the looks of it. We can't just waltz in through the front doors. No, we can't, Natsu agreed easily. Not if his head kept trying to split in half. It gave another jolt and Natsu squeezed his eye. Damn, that felt like someone buried an axe in his head. Natsu, Wendy asked worriedly. Natsu shook his head and his sister stayed quiet. Natsu's eyes turned to the older blue-haired girl in the group, who perked up at the sudden attention. Juvia, can you breathe under the water? Juvia blinked at the question. Yes, Juvia can. Why? Try to find if there is any. Natsu stopped as the pain moved from the back of his head to the front, the feeling like someone stuck the axe in his head changing to something that felt like his eye was being removed from its socket by a hot spoon. Shit. Wendy's eyes widened as Natsu slammed his palm against his right eye and the skin around it cracked like a spider web. Lucis and Gray's eyes widened as well, closely followed by Kat's, while Juvia just watched in confusion. Lucy and Gray saw it only 2 times, but it was enough to know by now that whatever happened to his hands was happening to his face. The skin started peeling off, painfully slowly, while Natsu gasped in obvious pain, something not even Wendy could say she saw before. And the Dragon Slayer's legs almost gave away and his knees buckled halfway before he managed to push them straight and bent down in his back, hiding his face from them. The blood soon followed, dripping to the ground with speed like he just cut himself open. Natsu shut his eyes closed as the skin around his eyes peeled off, dropping around his fingers in threads, a piece of it even remaining in his palm. He had incredibly high pain tolerance, but this was still too much, and as his eye continued to throb he could feel it melting, and soon it dripped to the ground along with the blood that followed before the new one started forming, and the Dragon Slayer could feel every nerve connecting again. This time his knees did buckle and he dropped to the wet sand. This wasn't supposed to happen. Natsu's left eye stared at the red sand with the dead look, unsure what to think, and horror was an emotion he learned to hide a long time ago. The skin goes first, father always said that. Inside's second. Natsu, Wendy called loudly, and it took Pinkhead another moment to realize she was calling him for some time now. Just give me a minute. Lucy and Gray exchanged a worried look as Natsu gasped again, gripping the fabric of his pants in his free hand until his knuckles turned white. The pain slowly lessened, and even though his head throbbed horribly he was capable to see what was going on around him. The white-hot pain left him unresponsive until then. Reluctantly he removed the hand from his eye, hissing as the cold salty air of the night met the recently reformed skin and eye and sent another wave of pain all the way through his spine. He looked up at Wendy, who blinked in shock before she squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head, unable to look at him for a moment. That bad, huh? Natsu. Happy looked worriedly at him. the damn blue cat walking right in front of him, and since he was still kneeling only inches away from his face. Natsu jerked back because of the closeness before tensely climbing to his feet, turning to face Gray and Lucy, who gasped. "What?" Natsu challenged. He had enough to deal with as it was. Their gasping and worried looks did not help, nor did he need them. "And nothing," Lucy replied, her eyes falling down. Gray just stared at him for another moment before he wordlessly clasped his hands and formed small ice mirror. Natsu raised an eyebrow at him, unpleasantly surprised. His right eyebrow was scally for the lack of better word. Despite the first instinct that told him to show that mirror down Gray's throat, he carefully took it and looked at his reflection. He would have frowned if he wasn't so careful not to show any reaction. Well, this is going to be hard to cover. What will Mira think of him now? Will she also start thinking he's a monster? Or, wait, that's way off the topic. Concentrate. His obsidian eyes were no longer staring at him from the mirror. The left had thankfully remained the same, and he dreaded the moment it would change, but his right was far from black. Even his sclera was no longer white. Red iris on light yellow sclera stared at him, his pupils in thin black slits. Out of curiosity, Natsu blinked and concentrated the tiny amount of magic into his right pupil, watching with some morbid degree of satisfaction as the pupil expanded, covering almost the whole iris and giving him night vision he didn't think was possible. He cut the magic connection short and the pupil delighted, and although his vision was not as great, it was still quite good. With a sigh, he crushed the ice mirror in his bandage-covered hand. The black scales surrounding his new eye were also standing out more than Elfman in Myra's clothing would. Juvia seemed to consider the idea for a brief moment before she responded. Yes. Juvia means no. What Juvia is trying to say, Juvia will do her best to find it. Natsu nodded and the blue-haired teenager dived under the water, disappearing underneath the black sea in seconds. Pink-haired dragon slayer stared at the water for few more moments, trying to adjust his uneven sight. The dragon eye in his right socket was throbbing painfully, and every time he turned it around it only worsened, feeling foreign. The sea and sand beneath him looked different now than they did before. His left eye didn't see the difference if he closed the right, but he could clearly see it with his right eye. And if he concentrated he could see a spider, almost as small as the grains of sand crawling on it. Disconcentrating, Natsu finally decided before he looked at the rest of the mages gathered around him. When neither of them looked him in the eyes he almost snorted. Perfect. The silence lasted for several minutes as Natsu decided to entertain himself with examining the tower while the rest stole glances at him he pretended not to notice. Half an hour later Juvia resurfaced and walked to the shore, her clothes dry. Or was it always wet but just didn't look like it? It was hard to imagine your body being made out of the water. Did you find anything? Natsu asked when the girl stayed quiet. Juvia nodded, almost reluctantly. Well, Juvia has, but it's pretty far away. Juvia is not sure you will be able to swim all the way without breathing, and the floor needs to be shattered so Juvia and you could enter. Lucy bit her lips harder, the lower lip already red from all the chewing, but the blonde couldn't help it. Gray folded his arms and bit his thumb. What to do? Wendy didn't look any less agitated, and Carla tried to comfort her, and Happy settled on her head, doing his best to comfort the girl as well, but not as good with words as Carla was. I'll go with you, Natsu finally said, and the people around him looked at him in obvious worry. It is almost 10 minutes away, Juvia tried to reason. Natsu stopped for a moment. He wasn't able to hold his breath that long. 7 minutes at most, and that was if he wasn't swimming and blasting things off. Natsu sighed. Good thing he had magic. Almost as if warning him, his head gave another throb, but he ignored it masterfully. All right, a reason more for me to go with you, Natsu said as he gathered her magic. Fairy tale mages behind him shifted worriedly. Dragon Slayer secret art. Element takeover. Water master. It proved that his head gave a throb of warning with a reason as the headache almost became unbearable again. Let's go. Natsu jumped in the water and Juvia soon followed. The girl fascinated when she realized Natsu's mismatched eyes both glowed soft blue color through the dragon eye kept its yellow sclera, water around his mouth and nose moving out of his way and swirling around his head creating a bubble of air. Useful spell, Juvia commented, and Natsu turned to look at her, obviously unable to speak underwater. Juvia turned her eyes forward and sped up when she realized Natsu had no trouble following. The further they went the harder it was for Juvia to see, and it was only thanks to her ability to feel the water around her she was capable of moving in the complete dark. Do you have trouble moving around? If yes, Juvia will help lead you, Juvia offered to the silent pink-haired teen whose eyes glowed in the dark in the same soft blue, the only feature she could see. Blue eyes turned to look at her, half-lidded in obvious, "Are you serious?" look that made Juvia blush. How silly of her, he couldn't answer to that. If you can blink, Juvia's proclamation came out more like a question before she could really think it trough. Natsu rolled his eyes but much to her relief blinked. You can see in the dark, like a cat. Another half-lidden look but also a blink. Juvia opened her mouth to ask something else, encouraged by his answers so far, but Natsu turned his eyes forward obviously done with talking. We're here, Juvia said after several more silently spent minutes and knocked on what appeared to be iron. Relatively thin by the sounds of it. Juvia believed these are trapdoors. Probably used for getting rid of thrash a place like this would make. They are probably locked and heavy, so you and Juvia should try being careful about this because it would make a lot of noise or you and Juvia could enter when you punch your way through 10 inches thick steel. Juvia watched as Natsu retracted his fist where it had punched the hole in before he drove it back in, this time hooking his fingers in the metal and bending it just enough to get up and pull himself in the room. He extended a hand to the girl below and pulled her up. Why didn't you use magic to break through that? Juvia questioned once both were out of the water. You sure ask lots of questions, Natsu said mildly, his eyes returning to their original colors. Juvia blushed again, feeling like she was talked down to like a child. He didn't answer her question but spoke instead. Juvia, you go back and tell the others we made it to here. I'll open the doors as soon as I can. Juvia's eyes widened slightly in surprise before she smiled and practically sprinted back to the hole. Gray, Juvia's love, Juvia is coming. Natsu stared at the hole for a moment before shaking his head in disbelief. Humans, he thought to himself before he turned to finally look where exactly did he ended up in. Dungeons by the looks of it if the empty cells around him were any indication. Well, empty was relative in this case. There were plenty of rats and skeletons decorating the room lit only by 2 torches, one at the end of the long corridor and other at the beginning. It was mostly silent, only squeaking of rats and mice disrupting it, so Natsu decided that no one heard his forced entry. Or didn't care. Cocky bastards if that's the case. Stuffing his hands into his pants pockets, the dragon slayer strolled forward, towards the metal doors, illuminated in an orange glow from the fire beside it. Natsu looked closely at the doors once he was in front of them, somewhat wary of the trap, but when he saw nothing that could categorize as the threat he took hold of the handle and tried to pull, but the doors wouldn't budge. With a sigh, Natsu rested his hand on the metal. He's done this before. Melting the metal with magic was actually relatively easy to do, but it could prove to be a problem because his body barely used any of its magic and he felt drained. Stupid dragonification. He had to be careful. Using too much magic with his coils already strained could prove rather dangerous, for someone like him especially. Pulsing the magic through the metal, he watched as it first dented before it started melting down, a wave of cold air washing over him like a freezing wind of winter months. It was amusing really because the doors really looked like they melted because of fire. Kageyama probably didn't find it as amusing. He soon stepped through the hole he created and looked at another corridor he stepped in, this one completely dark, familiarly dark. Natsu's eyes narrowed as he looked at the torch still shining behind what was left of the doors, and the dragon slayer took it from its holster and threw it in the darkness. The torch disappeared not foot from him like it never existed in the first place, and without the light behind him Natsu was left in complete darkness, the torch at the end of the hole barely even visible from the distance between them. Natsu cocked his head to the side and concentrated on the sounds around, listening for a heartbeat, for breathing before carefully taking a sniff of the air. A wicked smirk spread his lips, his eyes turning to slits, and as he licked his lips he noticed his canines turn to fangs, almost long enough to protrude from his lips even when closed. Natsu bent and lowered his brunt before he sprinted into the darkness, taking only a step before the torch far behind him disappeared completely. Simon, was it? Natsu wondered as he cocked his fist back and drove it into the stomach of his enemy, who gave a startled gasp and slammed against the wall behind him with a silent cry of pain. Damn, Simon muttered and looked up, capable of seeing the dragon slayer once again walking towards him, head slightly twisted to the side as if listening. How? You shouldn't be able to see me. I don't, Natsu easily admitted, a twisted smile spreading into a bloodthirsty grin that made Simon's skin crawl. Maybe I went about this the wrong way. Simon thought to himself as he scrambled to his feet and lifted his arms in a show of surrender, momentarily forgetting that he can see but the dragon slayer before him couldn't. He was reminded of the fact by another punch to his head, closely followed by the knee in the ribs. Natsu was on top of him in a second, one knee pushing his spine in the ground with surprising strength for someone a head lower than him and arms holding his behind his back, pulling on them so hard he thought they might pop out of their socket. Stop, stop. Simon gasped when Natsu's knee pushed further and his arms gave a crack obviously only an inch from popping out. Give me a reason, Natsu challenged and something sharp down into Simon's hand, almost cutting off his little and ring finger. Simon whined in pain trying to suppress a scream as whatever held his fingers tightened. I'm here to help. The grip on his fingers loosened but the knee in his spine didn't budge. Really? Natsu asked and Simon had little doubt his face was as blank as his voice. Natsu stared at the man underneath him, not really seeing him because of the spell still blocking any light. Not even spreading his right pupil had helped. Natsu knew the man was telling the truth. The frantic beating of his heart was hard to interpret but it was obviously because the man was panicked and it did not falter as he spoke to the pinkhead. Yes, Simon yelled, let go of me before you break my arms, will ya? Remove the spell and I might think about it. Natsu decided to make the man sweat a little bit more. Simon groaned, whatever from pain or frustration Natsu didn't care. I can't. If I do heal now you're here and he'll know I'm helping. Who is this he character you keep talking about? Natsu said loosening his hold on the human underneath him. Jalal. Simon whispered the name, looking around, almost as if afraid Jalal might hear him. Jalal. Natsu raised his eyebrow at him, he needed a better explanation than a name he did not recognize. He sent us to get you or Urza. He said Urza really since he knew we wouldn't be able to touch you. Not that we believed him, rather stupid of you, yes, I see that now but that's beside the point. He needs a strong source of magical power condensed in human form too. Simon swallowed, his throat suddenly feeling too small. To revive Zirf, Natsu jerked to his feet, his head snapping to Simon who could see the clear shock on his face. Wide mismatched eyes stared at him before the dragon slayer gained the control of his face muscles back and his eyes narrowed dangerously, a snarl escaping his mouth, the sound coming deep from his chest, forcing Simon, despite himself, to take a step back. They are trying to revive Zirf. They are trying to revive the only person who Acnologia owns. An Acnologia he would be furious if he heard this. Bring Zirf back, he's not even dead for God's sake. Simon looked around worriedly as a blue spark decorated Natsu's shoulder for a brief second and an even louder growl made its way past his lips. Natsu, I know you are worried about Urza but, Natsu. I know you are worried about Urza but, Natsu turned towards him showing just how well he could hear and smell him as he walked towards him, stopping only a step away and taking a handful of his robes. I'm not worried about her. The idiot plans to revive someone who is not even dead. Simon blinked in disbelief. Once. Twice. What did you say? Natsu punched him in the face, making sure to hold back just enough to leave a pretty nasty black eye and not collapse half of his skull in. Will you remove the spell or do I need to punch you again? Natsu leveled him with a glare Simon found utterly terrifying. The man couldn't even see him. He just knew where he was and yet he glared straight into his eyes. Simon swallowed again, trying to swallow the lump in his throat that wouldn't go away. I can't, he finally said. Jalal has lacrimas all over the place. He'll know you're here right away. If that's the case he already knows, Natsu replied and gave Simon a pointed look. Simon nodded reluctantly, despite knowing the man wouldn't see the nod. The tall mage released the hold-on magic that was spreading around them, the darkness disappearing. Natsu blinked as the light entered his vision, a torch shone only 2 feet away from them and the one he threw earlier still decorated the stone floor with its orange glow despite being on the floor for several minutes. Do you know when he plans to revive Zirf? Natsu gave Simon a more trolled look now that he could actually see him making Simon shift uncomfortably. Soon. Tonight even. Natsu growled again and turned his back to Simon who wondered whatever it was a show of trust or completely dismissing him as a danger. The later probably. Certainly. Simon grimaced. I'm going to find Jalal and you do me a favor and let others inside. They should be waiting outside if they listen to me, Natsu said, his steps quick as he moved to the end of the corridor where other doors stood. Others? Simon questioned nervously. What if they won't believe me? Natsu stopped in his stride and glanced at him over his shoulder, the dragon eye Simon knew the man didn't possess the last time he saw him, looking at him. Your problem? Simon's sweat dropped at the blank face and blunt voice before the dragon slayer moved past the door, this one unlocked. Era. Magic Council *. The room was large, huge even. The room was occupied by 9 people, all dressed in high-quality robes and serious expression decorating their faces. The blue magic circle was the only floor beneath them, but none seemed to care. A woman with dusty blonde hair seemed agitated, angry even. We can't let them activate our system, she all but screamed. I agree with Belno, Jalal must be stopped. A man of small height and animal ears protruding from his hair nodded his head, sneaking a glance at the talkative blue-haired man who was unusually quiet. Etherian, we must fire it, that's the only way to stop them on time. Seagrain almost sounded pained as he spoke. The second seat of the council eyed the man worriedly. Are you sure, Seagrain? Jalal is your brother. As Michello already said, he must be stopped. Seagrain gestured to the short man. Seagrain turned to look at the head of the council, a man of wide grid who gave him a careful look. I propose a vote, Seagrain spoke. Who agrees that we should fire Etherian is to say, yes. A chorus of, yes, followed his statement, and only a couple of councillors stayed quiet, unwilling to object but not in agreement for it either. The head of the council nodded at the obvious majority. Then so be it, Etherian will be fired, Crawford Seam said with a grim face. Unknown, Tower ***. Natsu sprinted through the halls, already feeling the dark magic gathering at the top. The tower was built in a strange and complex way, but in a way that allowed him to hear the others without much problem, even without concentrating on. There have been 6 enemies and only 5 of them if you didn't count Happy and Carla. Thankfully Urza's old friends were easily convinced who the bad guy in this situation was, and already seeing Simon with his own guildmates helped. Final doors, Natsu thought to himself as heavily decorated double doors came into view as he turned around the corner. He was sure those were the last, the magic he felt was behind. Urza's magical signature was behind those doors. Even if Jalal wasn't there, Urza was, and without Urza and himself they will have time, hopefully. Natsu threw the heavy doors open and a pair of brown eyes immediately fixed on him. And Natsu, Urza was beaten thoroughly if her figure, sprawled on her floor, was any identification. She coughed after saying his name, blood spraying the ground in front of her. A weird feeling settled in Natsu's stomach. He wouldn't call it anger. Not even worry, but it was there, turning the pit of his stomach into rock and making him feel something. He didn't like it, and since he was unfamiliar with it he settled for what he knew, and what was he familiar with? The expressionless face looked around the room. What better way to hide your conflicted emotions than to hide them all? Well, how nice of you to join news. The man, Natsu quickly spotted several feet away from Urza, smiled pleasantly. A man Natsu could easily recognize, and also a man he truly didn't expect to see here. Seagrain. Natsu raised an eyebrow as he looked at the man. Seagrain kept his pleasant smile. Not quite. Natsu's eyebrows knitted together. He knew the man, not well or on personal level, but knew him well enough to decide he didn't like him. He saw him plenty of times in the council and spoke to him several times, but the man always had that, "I'll stab you in the back" vibe Natsu despised. Well, if he was, not quite, Seagrain and he was searching for another man either way that meant. Jalal, Seagrain smirked. Smart as always. Kira, I prefer Natsu, Natsu said as he gazed at Jalal. Jalal kept his face the same, forced smile in place. A nice touch, that eye of yours. Trying to show your insides better. Natsu didn't bite the bait. He knew what the man was implying, but he wouldn't get angry. Why would he? Why so quiet? Nothing to say, Jalal asked in amusement as Natsu continued to stare blankly at him. I am going to kill you, Natsu stated mildly. I am just thinking whatever to do it slowly and tear limb by limb or quickly wring your neck. Jalal had the decency to laugh at the threat. He won't be laughing for long, Natsu mused as he watched the blue-haired man wipe an imaginary tear underneath his eye. Amusing as always, Natsu raised an eyebrow at him. Insane as always, Jalal snorted. You won't be such a smartass when my plan is finished. I guess I could warn you, it's almost done. You arrived just on time to witness it. Actually, witness what? Natsu asked carefully, concentrating his senses outwards. It happened surprisingly fast, too fast for even Natsu to follow as the black sky around them turned bright, so bright it blinded the dragon slayer more than looking directly at the sun at noon would. The ground rocked next, with the force that almost threw him off of his feet. The light consumed the tower and the ground shocked harder. Natsu gasped as the magic washed over him, drowning his senses for a brief second. His eyesight returned a moment later as quickly as it disappeared, the rapid change making the back of his eyes hurt. "Ah, right on time," Jalal said with a smug grin, looking around the tower. Natsu blinked at the floor beneath him, gray stone replaced by the blue crystal. A quick look around made it obvious the walls surrounding them were made of the same crystal, and Natsu had little doubt the rest of the tower was the same. "Do you know what is the actual name of this Tower of Heaven, the official name its creator gave it?" Jalal asked, ignoring Urza, who by now managed to pull herself into sitting position, trying to find the strength to stand. "Our system," Natsu said after a moment, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. He should have seen it before, really. Acnologia had drilled all of Zarif's creations during his teachings. The man's obsession with bringing back the dead was cut short somewhere around him becoming immortal if Acnologia was to be believed, and Acnologia was always right. The man probably decided there was no need reviving himself if he couldn't even die. "Our system," Jalal agreed easily. "Then you know that to run the R system you need enormous amounts of pure, raw energy. And what has more energy in this world than?" Jalal left the sentence hanging, gazing at Natsu leadingly, his clothes briefly replaced by sea grains, and Natsu's eyes narrowed in anger. "Etherian," Natsu growled in realization, Urza's eyes widening behind the pair. Natsu's fist shook as he glared at the blue-haired man. "Idiot." Jalal eyed the trembling fist and smirked. "Afraid? Try Furious." Natsu's voice came out in a growl, words barely recognizable over the deep growl. Jalal tensed, the smug expression becoming strained. He could almost taste the bloodlust rolling off of the dragon slayer in the air. Fighting back a shudder, Jalal forced the smile back on his face. "You will not defeat me," he sounded almost certain in that. "I am stronger than most wizard saints." Natsu let the magic flow through him, igniting his fists in black energy that licked over his scaled skin like tentacles of a vile creature from depths of hell. "I am stronger than most dragon generals," Natsu replied, his eyes gaining the maddened glint Urza easily recognized as the smirk stretched Natsu's lips. Pupils turned to slits once again and canines extended into fangs. "And I'll enjoy ripping your throat out with my bare teeth if I have to." Natsu licked his upper lip before he charged at the blue-haired man. Magic Council *, when you hit something with the strongest weapon you possess, a weapon with the strength to demolish half of their country in one go, you expect that a single tower would be gone along with the island it stood on. You don't expect to see a shiny blue crystal replace the once metal structure. The look over Lacrima's was certainly not a welcome one, and growling and snarling and hissing of the members was a good show of it. Yujima decided to voice his anger. "He tricked us." His eyes turned to Seagrain, who smiled at him, a wicked smile better suited for his face than that fake pleasant one he was so inclined to wear all the time, decided Yujima. "I will not deny it," Seagrain replied, and the members of the council turned to him, eyes ablaze in anger and fury as the room became suffocating under the pressure that started rising. "All of you are old fools and you can't blame a man for using it." Belno's eyes narrowed dangerously, but before any of them could move, Seagrain laughed and disappeared, leaving the room in shocked silence, anger only rising. Unknown. Tower of Heaven * Natsu ducked under his opponent's fist, driving his own elbow in man's stomach with incantation leaving his lips, Chaos Dragon's chaotic elbow. Jalal managed to move mostly out of the way, but the attack still grazed him, ripping the clothes from his abdomen and burning his skin with raw energy, making him gasp. Tattooed Man didn't let himself be distracted too long as he ducked under a kick and launched at the leg that remained on the ground, set on the idea of sending the pink-haired team crashing in the floor. Natsu jumped in the air over Jalal's own leg and planted his other feet in Jalal's back before pushing himself up in the air. Jalal crashed against the ground with a grunt but rolled on his back the moment Natsu's voice warned him of another spell headed his way. Chaos Dragon's wing attack. Jalal cursed and rolled out of the way and on his feet, jumping even further as the attack sent chunks of crystal flying around. Climbing to his feet, a new presence appeared beside him and Jalal smirked, turning to his carbon copy while Natsu landed, eyes trained on the newcomer. "Seagrain?" Natsu questioned. Something was off about the whole thing. Seagrain always seemed off for that matter, but now, with Jalal right next to him, Natsu could tell that Seagrain's magical signature was completely identical to Jalal's, and that should not be possible. No mage has the same magical signature, just like no human has the same fingerprint. It just couldn't be. It was quickly explained when Seagrain and Jalal laughed and their bodies merged together, magic dancing around them as Jalal's doubled. A thought projection, of the best quality, it would appear. Solid at that, Natsu mused out loud. Impressed, Jalal asked smugly and flexed his arms, puffing his chest out a bit. Hardly, Natsu snarled. So you can stop flaunting around like a cock. Urza blinked in shock, choking on her own spit while Jalal stared at him open-mouthed. Gathering his bearings quickly, Jalal launched himself at Natsu once again, hand cocked back and ready for a punch. Natsu ducked and Jalal faked to the side expecting Natsu to follow. Natsu jumped in the air, legs ablaze. Chaos Dragon's Claw. Jalal rolled to the side. Despite the wrong direction, the attack came from, still capable of using it to his advantage from the fake. Dark Mass. He slammed his fists together, black sphere forming between his fingers before it exploded in a shower of dark tendrils that rushed at the Dragon Slayer. Natsu's eyes narrowed as he sidestepped several and rolled under the next, only for them to turn behind his back and rush at him. Natsu growled and lit his hand in black and blue energy, slamming the magic-coated fist in the ground. The floor cracked before it shattered and Natsu fell through the hole of his own making, tendrils crashing against one another. Jalal raised his eyebrow at the seemingly stupid move but almost jumped out of his skin when Natsu's voice reached him from behind. Chaos Dragon's Claw. The attack hit him in the shoulder, sending him flying through the air until he crashed against the wall, stuck in the crystal from the force of the blow. Jalal groaned as he pushed himself out of it, right shoulder definitely broken as his arms hung limply at his side. Careful, Natsu admonished. Underestimating me will get you killed a lot faster. Jalal scowled, the message clear. Whatever you do, you will die. It was a question of when rather than if. I will revive Lord Zirf, he hissed at the pink-haired teen. Natsu scowled at him, anger rising again as he pushed the pain he felt in his own body to the back of his mind. Jalal didn't land a blow on him, but he was using too much magic as it was. He could feel the skin on his back peeling off, blood soaking the back of his shirt. Do you know why people have dreams? Natsu suddenly asked as he moved toward Jalal, crunching low and running, both hands ignited in black tendrils that swirled around wildly. Jalal's eyebrows scrunched together in confusion as scowl passed his face. Enlighten me, he drawled as he stepped to the side to avoid Natsu's attack, barely dodging the second hand as he tried to land a blow in Natsu's chest. Natsu sidestepped the blow and dropped to the ground, trying to swipe Jalal off of his feet, but the blue-haired mage jumped with a cry, Meteor. He shot off like a bullet, moving behind Natsu with speed more than twice larger. Natsu's eyes widened only for a brief second before another smirk passed his lips. He bent his body at an impossible angle just Jalal moved above him and drove his fist into the man's stomach. Jalal caught the blood right on Natsu's face, eyes wide in shock as he crashed against the floor, rolling over the blue crystal. People have dreams so that they can be crushed, Natsu replied with a wicked grin, using chaotic void to stand right in front of the man. Jalal scrambled away when Natsu reached for him, ready to pull him inside the void. With a fierce scowl, Jalal launched himself at Natsu again, golden light of meteor leaving a trail behind him. Natsu moved to the side to avoid the first blow and ducked under the second. Jalal turned around for the third strike and Natsu moved to step to the side yet again, hand glowing in black and blue. There was a sickening crunch and Natsu's hand twisted, the bone inside it broken and shattered completely. Natsu's eyes widened as the pain shot through his body, the skeleton in his arm twisting and reforming. Urza's eyes widened, the scarlet-haired mage still trying to get her body to move. Jalal's own eyes widened when the bone pierced the skin and Natsu gasped in agony. The blue-haired mage knew better than to waste the opportunity as he stopped, hand above his head, magic gathering in haste. Alteris. Jalal growled, the black sphere that formed above his head twisted and grew before it shot at Natsu. Urza scrambled to her feet, stumbling as she tried to move her friend out of the way. What exactly happened she had no idea, but judging by Natsu's usually pale skin practically white, black scales on his face even more pronounced and arms still twisting around looking like it was going trough, Grinder told her it took Natsu every ounce of concentration he had not to drop to the floor screaming. His eyes flickered to the black sphere and he took a shaky step back, bringing his other hand forward. Using magic while going through the process was dangerous and painful, agonizing. Natsu let another gasp, pain doubling while the magic he pushed to his other arm felt like molten lava. The Dragon Slayer knew that if he let the spell Jalal sent his way hit him he would not be able to fight. It might not kill him but it could get really close. Black sphere started forming in his own hand, a scream tearing from his lips. Dragon Slayer. Lost art. Natsu had to suppress the curse as he choked on every word. The sphere didn't grow any bigger than his palm, tiny lights and colors swirling around. Alteris was too damn close and too damn fast. Natsu glared at it, screaming even while he tried to push last two words of the spell. Black. A blur of white appeared in front of him, a person he quickly recognized outstretched his arms bracing for the impact. The spell exploded against Simon's wide frame throwing the man back and he landed with a grunt, only a feet away from Natsu. Jalal stared in shock at his missed chance, unable to even muster enough fury in the outcome he least expected. Natsu stared at Simon in shock as well through the reason completely different. You saved me, Natsu asked in astonishment, black ball disappearing and his arm finally settling in place. Pain still present but finally manageable. Simon looked at him, the tan-skinned man pale, a trickle of blood flowing from his mouth. I had to, was his reply. The man looked at Urza who was balancing herself on her feet with the help of her blade, too far to hear the whisper but close enough to see Simon. Take care of Urza. I loved her. Natsu stared in wonder as the man before him gave one last hacking breath, the life leaving him quickly. Simon. Urza cried in horror as she scrambled towards them as quickly as she could, Natsu noticing the long gash on her thigh and the twisted ankle now that she was on her feet, but the girl didn't let it stop her as she dragged herself to her childhood friend, eyes filling with tears that quickly dropped to the ground, some of them landing on Simon's chest as she buried her head in them. I'm not worth your life, Simon. Natsu shook his head, his eyes moving to the sobbing Titania. You threw it away, but thank you. Something twisted in his chest as Urza continued to sob, a pain he was not familiar with. A pain not caused by dragonification or physical wound grabbing at his lungs and heart, making it hard to breathe. What's wrong with me? Natsu scowled, eyes still on Urza while his anger for Jalal increased. He crossed the line. Natsu looked at Jalal who was still staring at them in shock. The blue-haired man looked back at him and twitched, taking a step back while a pair of dragon eyes stared at him. Natsu pushed his magic in his bones, a process he had not repeated for months if not years but still knowing it by heart. The bones twisted again but the pain familiar, nowhere near as intense as that of the dragonification. A crack echoed through the room, a spark of magic traveling along his shoulder before it disappeared only to be replaced by two more. Your first mistake was to take one of our own, Natsu explained to Jalal who took another step back. Your second mistake was to wait for me to show up, Natsu gestured to Urza who looked up, eyes fixed on Natsu as the magic became visible around him, surrounding him like an aura. Your third and final mistake was to make Titania cry, his voice distorted, twisted and overlapped with the growling, the words barely distinguished. The magic cowered him, hiding him from the two as his body twisted again. Scales covered part of his torso and framed his face. The bones in his legs twisted, knees bending the other way as they took the structure of hind legs of a dragon, tearing through his pants and boots. His spine cracked and reformed, expanding and growing as more and more vertebrate extended from his rear end, soon after warped in tight muscle and black and red scales. A pair of horns protruded from his forehead, curving back. For that mistake, I will show you something. Something very special. He moved to walk towards Jalal, slow steps echoing around them as the crystallized Etherian beneath his feet cracked from the intense pressure. You won't find a witness to this state, a hollow chuckle ripped off Natsu's throat. Because those who have seen it have perished by my hand. A painful, slow death that awaits you as well. The magic around him lessened, leaving Jalal with a clear sight of his front and Urza of his back. Urza gasped in horror as his shooter blades twisted as well, now that she could clearly see it and two bones protruded the skin, making a hole in the shirt before ripping it completely as the bony structure of the wings took place, wings of feathery scales forming as first muscles and then scales warped over them. Jalal watched in horror as the wings exploded from Natsu's back, the process without a doubt painful, but the dragon slayer before him didn't even twitch. The energy around him changed. Black remaining the same as it twisted and turned around him while the blue sparked and danced, turning from blue to purple and from purple to a bloody red. Urza bit her lip to stop herself from screaming. She didn't dare to lean to the side to see his face. It was a wicked creature. Unnatural. A word monster came to her mind, but she reminded herself that whatever was in front of her was still Natsu. Stay away from me, Jalal gasped as he took a step back, tripping over one of the protruding crystals and falling on his ass, crawling away in his haste, unable to get a proper hold of his limbs to climb back to his feet. Make me. Urza swallowed a lump. That was Natsu, she reminded herself even as horror and panic clawed at her lungs. A cruel, wicked killer who had little to no mercy, but still Natsu. She had to think of the irony for a second, because he truly looked like one of those pictures of fallen angels she saw a few times in Guild's library. Natsu, an angel. He to look like an angel of any kind was truly ridiculous. A demon, maybe. Do you know what you see? Natsu asked, his movements a blur as he stepped in front of Jalal, who frantically shook his head, his back against the wall even as Natsu's face came only inches from his. The pink-haired dragon slayer spread his wings, casting his face in shadow, his eyes gaining an eerie glow from the lack of light and their ability to reflect it. The tail crept around him, moving to Jalal like a snake. So deadly and poisonous, you know you have to run, but you remain still. Frozen in horror. You see me. His voice sounded almost mocking, but between the growling and double-layered tone, it was impossible to be sure. You see my soul, a soul of a dragon prince, a soul of a demon, but not a soul of a human. Not for many years. The tail snapped to the side like a whip, missing Jalal by a mere inch, making the man jump, a scream ripping from his throat. Do you know why you're so afraid of me? Natsu crunched in front of the man still screaming, Urza on verge of screaming herself. It was a valid question, she had to admit. She had no reason to be this terrified of him. Yet even as she thought that, the thought disappeared. Humans should not be able to see each other's souls, yet I am capable of bringing it out in a way that anyone can see it. Natsu gave Jalal a wicked grin. That is unnatural on so many levels that every primary part of you is screaming, unable to handle it. Jalal quieted down, breathing hard and pressing his back in the crystal walls even harder. What will you do? Jalal managed to choke out. The maddened glint in Natsu's eyes made him think he didn't want to know. I will torture you, kill you, tear your limbs apart, break your every bone and drain every drop of blood you have until this entire room is crimson from your blood. Jalal's eyes widened as he managed to push himself to the side just as the tail snapped again, this time piercing the crystal right where his head used to be. The man crawled away in fright, but the cold tail warped around his ankle, pulling him towards the grinning demon who stood and planted the clawed foot on his chest, curling the claws until they pierced the skin. Now scream. Jalal's eyes widened as Natsu's hand came to his forehead, index finger meeting the tattooed skin and talon digging into flesh. The skin sizzled and smoked as the potent magic circling trough Natsu's veins met the unprotected skin, the talon in the flesh going all the way to the skull. Urza shut her eyes and ears as Jalal screamed. She turned her eyes to Simon's cooling body, unable to look. Clapping her ears didn't truly help whatsoever because she was still able to hear it, the terrified screams and soon after the choking, wet sound that followed. She glanced up despite what her instinct told her, almost surprised to see Jalal mostly intact, not counting the gaping hole in his forehead and clawed chest. The blood covering his chin didn't even seem caused by the injury, but the hollow look in his eyes spoke more than the blood covering him. I always believed that killing a killer is not a sin, Natsu commented after a moment, cocking his head to the side as he watched Jalal with interest. His tail was warped around man's neck, slowly tightening as Jalal's face reddened, but the man remained limp in the tight grip, the only sign he was still alive the hectic rise and fall of his chest. Urza swallowed, finally finding her voice. If you kill a killer, the number of killers in the world remains the same. Natsu blinked and looked at her over his shoulder, giving Urza the clear view of his face for the first time. She shuddered but didn't look away as the eyes seemed to glow in the poor light. Then it's a good thing I killed dozens, Natsu informed the girl, who almost choked at the information. 78 inches, Natsu continued, his attention back on Jalal as he pulled back his hand and pierced the man's chest. The crunch of the ribcage shattered almost made Urza vomit as the blood sprayed the ground. 79 now. It was a sickening sight. To see your childhood friend being killed like that. Becoming another number in Madman's statistics. She knew Natsu was a killer. Everyone in their guild knew it, and it was no secret he more than once delivered a head to his employees. The only reason the council couldn't fuss about it was that all of those he killed were killers as well. Killer or not, something squeezed in her, almost choking her. Jalal was obviously lost, maddened beyond help, but she still held hope when she saw he was here. The hope was gone now, and despite herself, despite knowing that this might be for the best, she couldn't make herself believe it. The resentment settled in her despite her protests as Natsu threw the body through the window, the splash of the water as the body hit the black waves unheard by her ears, too far away. Natsu gave a sigh, sounding almost tired as the magic sparked around him once again, the transformation to his human self quicker than it took to take his other form. Urza looked at the dragon slayer who sat on the ground, a groan escaping his lips making her jump. If Natsu voiced his pain, Urza knew most would be wailing in it. His back was turned to her, black scales decorated his bare back, his arms, one resting on the cool crystal beside him, lacked the bandages that she was almost used to seeing now. The lack of bandages showed black scales, clean red lines decorating it. Are you alright? Urza asked carefully, the words tasting almost bitter. Wow, she was angrier than she thought. Natsu tensed and pulled himself around to look at her, his hand cupping his mouth, blood dripping from his palm. He didn't answer, just looked at her with a dry look. What do you think? Urza's eyes narrowed. She had every right to be angry, she decided. Fairy Tail has a no-killing policy. Why Master Makarov put up with him was beyond her. Whatever it was, his answer or a simple necessity, he removed the hand, coughing out more blood before something dropped down. It took her a moment to realize what it was, but she had to swallow the bile that rose in her throat once she realized she was looking at his tongue. Natsu would have cursed if he could as his throat burned. Damn transformation for messing up with his body. He could feel quite a big number of his bones still shifting. Pain almost paralyzing him, but he managed to keep straight face. Urza was watching him like a hawk, and it didn't take a genius to see she was angry. Why the heck is she angry? Natsu scoffed, feeling the muscle in his mouth reforming. Gods really must hate him. Can't that go any faster? Do you need any help? Why was she asking him that? She was obviously asking it through her teeth, so why? Natsu shook his head and climbed to his feet, swaying terribly and almost toppling over. The ground shook and Natsu grunted as he fell to the ground mid-step. A slurred curse escaping his lips as the forked tongue formed in his mouth. Was it just or did ground? Ely shook. Urza blinked, her eyes on him, the short but strong earthquake momentarily forgotten. Will, why, Answer or Gok lick, a fish. Earthquake. Urza answered after another moment. Dad was Eterian, what? Natsu cleared his throat, pain and tiredness making him quite easy to annoy. That was Etherian, what? The tower will explode any minute now, Natsu growled as he pushed himself to his feet again. Urza's eyes widened and the ground shook again, making Natsu stumble, but he managed to stay on his feet this time, moving toward the crystal in the middle of the room. This kind of energy was made to explode and then disappear, not to stay locked in a crystal. It should have been released by now. Wait, what are you saying? Urza asked carefully. We're all going to die. Urza stared at him. How can you sound so okay with it? I'm not. Urza once again could only gawk at him. Losing his cool was not something she saw happen to Natsu. He seemed to realize that as well because he clamped his mouth shut, frustration clearly visible on his face, and it made her only more worried. Just how tired or in pain he was. Can't you use chaotic void? Urza asked carefully. No, Natsu sighed regretfully. I've used too much magic already. I might as well cut my own throat, but your magic reserves. They are so big and spent, Natsu said dryly. Dragonification is draining me constantly. The more I use, the more it drains. My reserves are barely refilling ever since the process started. Urza watched as her guildmate continued to walk towards the crystal. A crystal she knew what it was used for. Jalal was generous enough to explain it to her. She stood up as well, standing significantly closer than Natsu and capable of walking without stumbling. She made a quick walk towards it. What are you doing? Natsu asked her, stopping in his painful stroll. What you plan to do? Urza said. I might not like you too much right now, but you are a member of Fairy Tail. I will die for my friends, even though you don't consider me to be one. It was more of a statement than a question, and Urza didn't bother to answer. She wasn't sure she could even consider him a human. She entered the crystal, the coldness that seeped into her bones making her gasp. Her mind fogged, scattering her thoughts. It was a strange feeling, losing sense of yourself so quickly and easily even as you desperately cling to it. How stupid of you. Black Hand entered the crystal after her, grabbing her shoulder. You don't die for your friends. You live for them. She blinked in shock, staring at the wet sand she found herself on, the tower of heaven towering above her. She knew what it meant and it made her scream to the heavens, scream in frustration and anger, grief and confusion. Of all people, he sacrificed himself. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. The next part will be out soon.